At the entrance to the castle, Lady Wu Yue and her bodyguard stood discussing the decision that her child needed to leave this place because otherwise he would die. The woman touched the most precious treasure in her life for the last time, her newborn son with sapphire eyes. From the warmth of the mother's hands, the baby fell asleep, and the lady, experiencing the pain of parting, asked her child for forgiveness. Since he was the only descendant of divine power in the world, he was hunted, and he was exposed to lifelong danger, which was already awaiting both the mistress and her child. The lady heard that the killers were close and hastily gave the baby to the bodyguard and made him promise to send the boy to a place where he would never be found. The child was separated from his mother, and the powers were sealed, and now the bodyguard stands in front of the woman whom he instructed to raise the boy, finally saying that he must return and protect the mistress, and the baby will have to survive relying only on himself. While the child was abandoned in the slums full of sin in the castle, all 7 clans rose up against one Lady Wu Yue, and one of the leaders advised the woman to go with them in an amicable way. There was only one reason for the current circumstances, and that was the envy of the gods, so the clans who took this path would soon regret what they had done. Meanwhile, the boy living in the slums and surviving the harsh life was actually God who fell like a star from the sky. The guy had to fight for his life, running into trouble because he was able to get food for himself. As a teenager who lost his memory, he walked across the blade of a knife every time in order to live another day. It was difficult for the guy to resist gangs of healthy and brainless scum who could beat him every now and then for infiltrating foreign territory. But this was the case until he was 18. People always demanded bread in circuses, so the identity of Lady Wu Yue's son and the man was revealed by one random display of fighting. The hunt continued, so mercenaries were released to kill an important target. As if awakening from sleep, the defenders approached the meeting one by one, not lagging behind the thugs. Each of the heroes mastered the technique of their family in order to fulfill their destiny. The heroes were students of their own parents who passed on to their children not only wisdom, but also skills. Some of the descendants were created completely from scratch to carry out a mission on a global scale. Some had to say goodbye to their parents and, despite their appearance, go to fight. During the confrontation, the dark and light sides merged in the struggle to maintain balance in the world. Tears washed away the bitterness of loss, and the empty place inside acquired a fierce fire of desire to live. In place of loneliness and hopelessness, there was a friendship that was stronger than any weapon. Different stories merged together, intertwining the past and the future, creating a new time. The haunting feeling of the ground disappearing from under their feet haunted the heroes literally and figuratively. The risk of destroying the world was each time closer than one could imagine. The lands of the exiles looked like a post-apocalyptic city, washed in blood and crushed by ash and dirt. Only thanks to signs and dim lanterns could one see the streets. The air was so polluted, and a guy stood in front of one of these bright advertisements, reading the details. The advertising banner announced a fight club called The Walking Dead, the slogan of which was that death is hope, and the maximum winnings for a survivor were 3 million. It was the sum of money that attracted the guy, and he thought in his head that if he could win, then this money would be enough to buy something for one person. The stream of thoughts was interrupted by a sharp clap of a palm in the back and the question of what the guy was staring at. The boy with sapphire eyes timidly shouted that it was nothing, thereby giving himself away completely. The guy, very funny, tried to cover the huge banner with his body, but his friend was still able to read what was written on the sign. A friend was very skeptical about the advertising slogan, not understanding what kind of hope after death he was talking about, and added that only silver people could come up with such an advertisement. A friend explained that it was as if they were living on a chessboard. In fact, the silver ones turned their lives into a game, forcing people to exterminate each other, taking comfort in this. The guy pointed his finger at his friend with suspicion that he had already thought of something, but the boy turned his head, denying these suspicions. The young man decided to shift his focus and asked his friend if he had gotten supplies. The friend pulled aside his cloak, which hid not only supplies but also a prosthetic arm, and answered with a smile that he managed to get food for dinner. The boy with sapphire eyes was glad and at the same time proud of such a life companion. But the smile suddenly disappeared from the guy's face as he took a closer look at the prosthetic on the arm of his friend Ah-chun. The boy understood that there was no room for delay, and it was time to remove the prosthesis because, due to its rust and malfunction, the arm was rotting. Ah-chun looked around and awkwardly covered the supplies with his cloak, reminding his friend that if anyone saw their food, they would be in trouble. Chun grabbed his small comrade by the clothes and dragged him into the shelter like a small child. The guy had no choice but to accept his fate. But a plan was already firmly ingrained in his head on how to get money. In an abandoned alley behind the truck, some hooligan was snatching the last food from the hands of the poor guy. The weak and defenseless old man had a lack of strength due to lack of food, and no matter how he grabbed the food, the hooligan threw the elderly man to the ground for his life, snatching the box of food and wished his grandfather to die quickly. The robber sat down and the truck started moving, and in the back lay a mountain of such boxes, and when the old man begged not to take the last one, the hooligan shouted that if the grandfather wanted to eat, then let him give him money. The thief threw food into the back of the car, along with the rest of the boxes, shouting that they had filled the car to capacity and that special supplies were written on the containers. All this time, two friends stood between the walls of the houses, waiting for the truck to leave, and if the younger guy concluded that now it was impossible to walk this road and asked Chun to leave, then Chun told his friend to wait. The guys looked at the old man who was screaming in despair and waited for the right moment. Chun checked to see if there was anyone else besides them and the old man and walked out from under the gate. Chun shouted to the old man to catch and throw one of the containers with supplies. The poor fellow crawled to the box and Chun shouted after him to quickly return home and not wander around the street. The old man ran home as fast as he could, clutching the box of food to himself. And the poor man's fear was quite understandable because in the exile zone people endlessly fight for food, and those who do not have the strength to protect themselves can only die. The guys looked after the running man, and Chun said that they shouldn't linger here either. The old man, holding in his hands his last hope of holding out a little longer, ran into the door of the house. The poor fellow climbing the stairs heard voices from those who were worse than death, and raising his head, realized that if he did not want to die, he would have to give up the food. Humanity, kindness, and trust in the exile zone are worth nothing, but there is only death, and it doesn't matter whether you have food or not. Meanwhile, the guys also returned to the shelter, and Yue criticized Chun for giving his portion to the old man. But the comrade, calling his friend an imp, said that half was enough for one. The guys lived in an abandoned garage in a closed courtyard, and Chun was the first to reach the house and raise the roller blinds. Yue counted the amount of supplies and turned to Chun with the fact that he found out how to get to the prefecture. And for this, you only need to change your prosthesis to a new one, and then you can apply for residence for work. The young man concluded that due to being in the prefecture, they would see each other less often and, without hearing any reaction from his friend, Yue looked in his direction. Chun was already fast asleep, lounging on the sofa in what he was wearing. He just took off his prosthesis. Yue quietly approached and carefully covered his friend with a blanket so as not to wake him. On the box next to the sofa lay Chun's prosthesis, and Yue stood in front of it and looked at it. Yue picked up the prosthetic on the dial of which an error had clearly been glowing for a long time. Every time Yue looked at the prosthesis, he shuddered from the memories of that day when everything happened, because Chun asked if he and Yue should go to the distribution of rations and Yue refused his friend. This was the last time Chun waved his right hand after the fleeing Yue. Chun stood holding his backpack with his hand and watched as his friend ran to get food from the distribution point. Since the guy was standing next to the gateway and looking forward, he did not notice the hand that was approaching him. Dry and sinewy hands grabbed the boy, holding his hair and covering his mouth, and dragged him into a dark gateway. Yue, joyful with a box in his hands, turned to the side where his friend stood, shouting that he managed to get food. The boy ran to the place where his friend was supposed to stand, but looking around, Yue did not see Chun anywhere. Approaching closer to the dark gateway, Yue heard some strange sounds coming from there. The guy took a turn, and what he saw caused the box to fall out of his hands, and he couldn't make a sound, as if he had swallowed his tongue. Chun lay on the floor in a pool of blood, and from the shock of pain he could only faintly wheeze for Yue to save him. Next to the boy, covered in blood, some exhausted and wild man was slurping and crunching, who, having heard the sound of the box on the ground, turned towards Yue. The savage extended Chun's gnawed hand towards Yue, asking if the guy also wanted a piece. The boy was covered in cold sweat and cried out loudly, realizing what had happened to his friend. And so, Yue once again, having squandered this terrible story, looked down at the prosthesis, reproaching himself for the fact that if he had not left Chun alone then, everything could have been different. Yue sighed heavily and sat down next to him on the bed, continuing to hold the prosthesis in his hands. The guy put the prosthesis back on the box and quietly said for Chun to wait for him. Yue was eating wine, and he finally told the sleeping Chun that he owed him a hand and came out of the shelter looking from under the roller blinds at his friend. The young man decided for himself that he would return before dawn and then lowered the roller shutter down. Meanwhile, in the stands, the crowd was frantically shouting the countdown to the start of the fight. The guy stood on the podium at number 4 in front of armed thugs, ready to kill him as soon as the countdown ended. Yue was already terribly beaten and bloodied, but the goal of getting these 3 million kindled the fire in him to reach the end. If you could look at the place where the divine child was thrown from a bird's eye view, you could see a division into 3 completely different worlds, and the highest of them was the Pantheon, and in the middle was the prefecture, and at the very end the zone of exiles. This entire circle rules in the world of espers, where every child upon reaching 8 years of age is required to undergo an ability rank assessment. Having determined a person's abilities, they put on a collar with information about the wearer that corresponds to internal strength. And each collar, in turn, had a specific color according to one of the 5 ranks into which people were divided. And the very first of them was special or golden. The second in rank was considered the highest or silver, which was also a good privilege. The penultimate were the middle and ordinary ranks, and the colors were copper and gray respectively. The lowest color was black, which was worn by the so-called scum, which is where Yue ended up. In order to get into the ring, Yue had to come to the registration point at the Walking Dead Club, where those who wanted to were loaded onto a bus. But there was little appearance, and everyone who wanted to get into the ring was still scanned before that. The guy approached the inspector, and the officer pointed the scanner beam at Yue's collar. The scanner beeped with an error signal, and a red card appeared on the screen with Yue's photo on it. The inspectors were wearing copper collars, and one of those who was wearing glasses raised them to look at the guy, and Yue immediately explained that this warning pops up every time he receives food for many years. The inspectors immediately began to discuss this problem since they had never encountered anything like this before. And although in the exiled zone it makes no difference to something like this, in the prefecture they should be more careful. So the one with the glasses told the second one to scan again. But even the second time, when the scanner beam was aimed at Yue's collar, the equipment gave an error signal. The inspector with glasses shook his head, indicating that it would be impossible to let the guy through. And behind Yue, meanwhile, there was an irritated exclamation from one of those who wanted the small fry to get out of the queue since he couldn't register. Yue continued to show the back of his head to the irritated man standing behind him, ignoring his angry cries and threats. And when the big guy in the yellow jacket came up to slap the guy on the back of the head, Yue very deftly waved his hand. At the moment, Yue was dodging the hands of the enraged man opposite the bus, sitting on the remains of the store. Those who were not allowed onto the transport were watching everything. The guy looked indifferently at the huge idiot in front of him, who apparently had no intention of calming down. This inadequate person, as if on purpose, decided to tease Yue by not only looking at him, but making a face. But Yue, without answering anything or even raising an eyebrow, turned back to the inspectors with a request to scan again, which shocked not only the inadequate guy, but also the inspectors themselves. The young man began to explain to the inspectors that he needed to get to this fight, but immediately Yue's gaze caught the threat behind him and reacted. The stupid pile of muscles decided to kick the kid so that it would finally be his turn to get on the bus, but he never expected the guy to dodge. And when Yue dodged and the bully was sitting on the splits, which he clearly could not do, the guy finished his proposal to the inspectors. The officers looked at each other and exchanged a few words that the guy was actually not a mistake. And one of those who sat opposite the bus also did not remain indifferent to what the boy was able to do. Throwing mud at the guy, the would-be fighter in a yellow jacket tried to pull himself together. Being behind the young man's back, this freak wanted to act in the most base and vile way, as befits scum, and took out a hidden knife. The inspector with glasses said that Yue's data had been re-uploaded, so he could get on the bus for now, and the second officer, meanwhile, held the fool with a knife. The officer looked at the big man and calmed his ardor, saying that he would still have time to do what he had planned, adding that he could kill the guy in the ring. Duralai made a dissatisfied face and had to calm down to get on the bus. One of the refuseniks stood and was indignant at the fact that the inspectors had problems with their eyes because they took a skinny monkey, that is, Yue, but they didn't, to which another refusenik explained that different people should take part in the battles because it's more interesting. The refuseniks looked at the window where Yue was visible and laughed because the ratings would creep up, and that they couldn't wait to see how little they would do in the ring. One of the refuseniks knew something more than his narrow-minded friend surprised them by explaining that because of idiots like them, of which there are quite a lot, people without abilities were labeled as scum, which allowed the espers to play with them. This man stood up and, without waiting for an answer from the scum or understanding, put out his cigarette and headed towards the bus. The man decided to add that the guys were very lucky that they were not chosen because they would be able to take a couple more breaths, and not paying attention to the indignation and a bunch of questions, he walked further to the bus. The refuseniks thought that this man was the same as them and therefore sat next to them, but he told them that by chance he decided to smoke on the side. This man seemed familiar to the scum, and turning to them in profile, the man asked if he had won enough fights yet. And raising his hair and throwing his head back, he reminded that in front of them was Qin Tian, the owner of a series of victories for the Walking Dead Club. Because of his outerwear, the scars that Qin had accumulated for 40 years as the king of the ring, having already won 8 victories in a row, were not visible. The inspectors turned to Qin so that he would not miss the flight again and board the bus. Qin climbed into the spacious interior of the transport, which was taking many passengers to certain death. The doors of the bus closed, and from that moment on, just like on other days, the hope was only for survival. In this part of the world, no matter how hard you try, death cannot be avoided, and even now the bus only went in one direction. While the bus was moving in a given direction, the server department of the prefecture was already looking through information about those who were traveling here. Someone actively went through the buttons on the keyboard until he came across the necessary information. In front of the monitors that illuminated the dark server room, the silhouette of a man stood looking at something on the screen. A person from the gold rank noted that the eyes of the one who is now on the screen are so similar to the eyes of a certain woman. A dossier of Shan Yue, whose age was 18 years old, was displayed on the screen, but the address was not indicated, and it was by his eyes that the man recognized that the guy was a child of God. Shan looked at the passing picture in the window and was worried about returning before dawn, and then Chun would not know anything, because otherwise he would scold Yue. Shan's imagination ran wild, and he imagined his friend with a baton in his hands and realized that this was even worse than him now going to the ring, which was very funny. Yue looked into the reflection of the window and saw that same stupid big guy in a yellow jacket swinging over him with a knife. The big man kept itching to kill the kid on the way to the ring, so without hesitation he raised the knife over him. And at that time the guy felt for the seat button and without panicking and without getting up, pressed it. Shan brought the seat to the sleeping position and thereby struck the big man's hand, causing the knife to fly out. The knife flew off and stuck its tip into the ceiling of the bus as if into butter. One of the passengers displeasedly asked whether it was really necessary to fight right here, and Yue, meanwhile, jumped from his seat to his feet in front of the big man. Qin noticed all these movements on board, but so far he indifferently watched the already so ordinary sight. Although the big guy was big and strong, his weak brain and state of madness really betrayed him, because his interest only peaked after Yue's reaction to the knife, and now the dumbass threatened the guy that he wanted to grind him into powder even before the fight. Shan understood that the situation was crap, because now you can't waste your energy on this stupid guy. The guy decided for himself that he needed to finish everything as quickly as possible, otherwise he would not be able to cope with the main battle. But remembering his strength, Yue stopped, because if he gets into a fight now in front of everyone and even with his abilities, he will be like an eyesore. Shan stood in front of a pile of muscles in the form of a big man, trying to gather his thoughts into a heap to decide what to do. And as soon as the dumbass wanted to make a dash towards the young man, shouting that he would finish the boy off, Qin's blow flew right into his face. Qin grabbed a piece of meat on the fly, which was already unconscious, and walked forward while Shan tried to digest what had just happened. The bus driver noticed Qin's blow and asked the fighter that until they reached their destination, this healthy forehead would be inspected by him. Qin Tian smiled and told the inspector that he could rely on him, and the big man wouldn't wake up until he arrived. Yue stood rooted to the spot and could not believe how Qin was able to kill such a large guy with one blow. When Qin walked back, still looking at the big man like a teddy bear, Shan timidly thanked the fighter, but immediately realized to himself that if he ran into this man in the ring, he would definitely not see not only victory but also life. Qin confirmed for himself that the guy was still young if he thanked the enemy, but at the same time noted that Shan was lucky. But that was until he met Qin in the ring, and then it dawned on Yue, who was standing in front of him. At the moment when Shan stood with his finger raised and realized that in front of him was a difficult person, but could not utter a word, a knife fell from the ceiling on Qing's head, hitting him with the handle right in the top of his head, but the fighter did not even flinch. The bus left the exile zone and approached the tunnel, and at the same time the wall dividing the land of scum from the prefecture. On the other side of the tunnel, there was light, as in all life and philosophical statements about hope. The closer the bus approached the exit from the tunnel, the brighter the light became, as if there was just a bright emptiness there. And only after entering the prefecture's possessions could one understand where such a bright source of light was coming from, because unlike the exile zone, everything here was blinding with its variegation and brightness. Shan saw something different for the first time in his 18 years of living in dirt and darkness. The guy's eyes opened wide in order to have time to see absolutely everything in the place where the Supreme Ones live. The bus stopped at a statue in front of the arena, representing what is happening inside the huge structure. While the fighters were heading towards the exit and Chin was still carrying the big man like a toy in his bosom, Shan stood and looked at the tall statue. The face of the statue looked worse than ordinary death, because if death comes and takes you away, then this personification of the club takes comfort from the sight before taking you away. The crowd was already in full swing after the previous battles, and now shouted even more in anticipation of the newly arrived fighters. The spectators were people in silver collars and suits, as befits the prefecture. The new arrivals walked along the corridor, unlike the young man who kept looking at everything as if in a museum. Shan's attention was drawn to a cart that was being driven by two people in the same gray suits as the bus inspectors. One of the men was carrying a cart with corpses covered with a black cloth, and the other was walking next to him with a tablet in his hands. The workers passed by Yue, and the guy followed them with his gaze, realizing that those in the cart were the killed participants. Indignant that during this battle there were a lot of dirty killings and a lot of blood, one of the workers pulled the cloth from the cart in which 3 dead men lay. In this entertainment complex for the prefecture, everything was provided for a long time ago, and for the convenience of the staff, there were special buttons in the floor. The worker who was driving the cart, after pressing a button in the floor, threw the bodies into the hole behind the door, which rose. The corpses fell down from the cart like garbage, which was actually garbage for the prefecture. It's scary to imagine how deep that hole is, and how long ago it has been filled with corpses, the number of which continues to grow. For Shan, everything that he just saw was not new, and he accepted his fate and the fate of those who died in silence. Meanwhile, in a luxurious estate with its own garden, to which the hands of the architect laid hands, the sun was shining brightly. At the entrance to a huge house with high doors stood a servant waiting for the owner. When the doors opened, the servant informed the master that the day spoken of in the prophecy had arrived. The master left the house, and the servant bowed to the master, saying that he could set off on his way. In the preparation room at that moment, there were 7 people in the form of fighters, fresh meat for the slaughterhouse, including Yue, and each of them had their own number and color. Shan carefully watched who got what weapons, and these were brass knuckles and daggers. 2 more guys had a club with nails and a staff, which was pretty good. Unlike Shun, who did not have any weapons, he also got an unlucky number, namely 4. It was not without reason that the guy didn't have a weapon, because that's what the rules of the competition said, which stated that there were 7 participants and 6 weapons. Whether you have a weapon or not is decided by the rating assigned by the audience, and accordingly, the higher the rating, the better the weapon, and the fighter in priority. And a participant with a minimum rating must enter the arena unarmed, which can often immediately be a death sentence for the poor fellow. But Shan was calm on this score, because no one would defend against an opponent with a rating of 1.2% and without weapons, respectively. The majority would focus on the strongest with the highest winning rating. While Yue was thinking about everything, Qin Tian approached the entrance to the room and looked at the young man. The king of the ring did not say anything but turned around and left, but the guy's head was still filled with thoughts that he was worried about Qin's strength. And Yue also came to the conclusion that it was not so difficult for a fighter with such abilities to survive in exile. One of the participants came close to Shan and asked the guy if he knew the king of the ring. Since Yue, as usual, ignored the opponent's words, the fighter with a rating of 30.5% again asked if the little one knew Qin Tian. This time Shan answered in the negative, realizing that there was nowhere to go anyway, to which the Troika replied dissatisfiedly that he only wanted to find out if Qin would help the guy out, and asked what was wrong with Yue's face. The Troika did not lag behind the boy, and looking closer and closer into Yue's face, asked if the guy was hiding something, because as far as the Troika knew, Qin only cared about strong guys, and Shan replied that that was not the point at all, because he was even without a weapon. Troika leaned his forehead on Shan's forehead, and continuing to smile menacingly, warned the guy not to lie, and continuing that otherwise he would not let him out, he put a gun to Yue's stomach. The sound of the start of the competition came from the ring, and Yue smiled sweetly and wished him good luck. Workers in gray uniforms stood in front of the ring steps and addressed the participants with the condition that in order to ensure proper conduct of the competition, they needed to put on the prepared equipment before entering the arena. In the hands of the club employee were 7 round devices that at first glance looked like tablets or magnets. One of the fighters shouted that these were mini-bombs, and the Troika cynically told the workers that they had a dime a dozen trump cards in their pockets, and the fighter behind the Troika, and Yue was clearly shocked by the turn of events, and the guys in uniform replied that the fighters could perceive bombs as gifts. There was nowhere to go because the outcome was still the same, so everyone took away the so-called gifts. Shan, like everyone else, put a bomb on his collar and asked the workers if he could now enter the arena, to which they agreed. Amid the howls and roars of the audience, as well as stormy applause, the fight was soon to begin. Drones were flown to record and broadcast the battle, and the announcer announced that there would be only one survivor in this competition. The announcer addressed the participants with the condition that before the timer runs out, they need to try their best to kill all their opponents, because if one of them shows mercy, they will turn into a piece of meat. And while the participants stood in the ring preparing for the massacre in the royal preparation room, the highest-ranking fighters were discussing who would die first and whether to bet on the fourth. Among the kings of the ring was Qin, and while others were glued to the screen watching the fighters, Qin sat indifferently on the sidelines. The excitement and expectation of the instant death of the four gave way to bewilderment on the faces of the fighters. While the kings were indignant and shouted that this was not normal, Qin was amused that the battle was already becoming interesting. The bat hit the ring bars, and the crowd raged that something like this could not be possible. The guy bent over with the bat couldn't believe how Shan so deftly dodged all his attacks. The fighter swung his baton again and, shouting that this was not funny at all, rushed towards Yue. But the newcomer still dodged the deadly blows of the bat with nails as if it were a dance. Shan looked at the guy with the club with his sapphire eyes and said that he was fighting and moving too slowly. This infuriated Five, and he swung his baton again. But Yue dodged and thought to himself that the fighter was full of combat shortcomings. Having escaped from the blow of the bat, Yue emerged with his fist and hit the Five in the jaw. Fighter number 5 prevailed over Yue, both in height and weight, so the blow came with difficulty for the young man. The kings of the ring discussed whether such reflexes were even possible, watching on the screen as Shan waved his hand after the blow to relieve the pain. Yue was in pain, and he clenched and unclenched his palm, looking at the bloody knuckles, but still understood that he could not use his power yet. Five laughed at the boy, asking if it hurt him, and Shan did not hesitate to answer that the fighter had thick skin, which angered the big man, and he threatened to kill Yue. Shan noticed that another fighter was approaching the Five from behind, twisting the guy with the club whom he was threatening to kill. But the Five didn't have time to react, and the knife was already at his throat, and the last thing he heard were the words, "He's mine." The one who could not calm down his ardor, even on the bus, had already dealt with the Five, and now became closer to Yue. Shan looked at the big man in the yellow jacket and saw that he had killer energy. Deuce, wiping the blood from his face, told the guy that he made him look like a fool on the bus, and that's why they weren't finished yet. But if Yue was killed by someone else, then who would be the big deal to deal with? 10 minutes remained on the scoreboard out of 15, and the signal for the elimination of the 5th player sounded just as there was no longer a 7th. The 6th player ran up to the bars and with tears and hysterics pounded on it, shouting that he was giving up and wanted to refuse to participate, and that he didn't even need money just to be let out. While the 6th was trying to get out and shouting to be let out, the workers standing at the steps looked at each other. One of the uniforms had a remote control with a red button, and looking at the number 6, he pressed it. The small tablet on the collar lit up red and beeped. There was another participant standing near the 6, and he had to cover himself from the explosion and the blood that scattered around. One fell to the floor and screamed in hysterics, while the 6's collar rolled on the floor. On top of the 7 sat a Troika with a pistol, scolding the workers for stealing his screen time. Troika looked carefully at the headless corpse whose head had just been blown out by an explosion. It is not known what was going on in his head, but the Troika decided to hit the already dead 7th in the face. The Deuce at that moment was running around the ring with a knife behind Yue, and the guy was still dodging except for the last moment. Shan slid some distance from the two, realizing that the speed and strength of the enemy had increased, and this really only indicated that he was restraining himself on the bus. At the last moment, Deuce was still able to strike with a knife, which landed on Shan's leg, and the guy made a decision for himself that if he continued to dodge, he would achieve nothing and would waste his time and energy. Getting ready for further struggle, Shan asked in his head what he should do, and this question was addressed to his friend. Yue remembered the moments of his and Chun's training that they had to arrange in order to survive and protect themselves in the exile zone. Chun looked at his friend Yue with pride because the guy had become even better, and if before he could be hit a couple of times, Now it was impossible to even touch Sean. Chun looked at his out-of-breath friend and realized that his movements were more and more like some kind of superpower. Yue begged for rest, but Chun insisted that even though his friend had quite good defense, when faced with danger, Sean would not defeat anyone with his dodges. Chun showed his fist to his friend and said that attacking is the best way to win, adding that from now on they will train even harder. A determined friend shouted to Yue whether he was ready, despite the fact that Sean loudly repeated that they would now rest. And in the moments when Sean could not attack Chun during training, he got the impression that a curse had been placed on his body. Yue fell dead tired on the sofa next to Chun, and his friend was glad that Sean was becoming better at dodging every day, but was upset that his friend had not improved his attacks because at this rate his enemies would grow old before he defeated them. Yue lay neither alive nor dead, trying to catch his breath, and Chun kept thinking about the fact that this, although strange, was quite interesting. A friend expressed his assumption that the lack of strength could be connected with the woman that Sean always sees in his dreams. Chun leaned towards Yue's ear and quietly clarified that he meant the woman with the divine ring. But Sean indifferently replied that it was just a dream about that divine thing and asked how it could be connected with his power. Chun hugged and encouraged his friend, telling him not to be sad because at least the enemy wouldn't be able to hit him, and added that if in the future he came face to face with danger, he just needed to run away. Yue was devoured by guilt for the fact that he was always hiding behind the back of the one-armed Chun, and this only made him hate his weaknesses and incompetence more. The guy recalled how he threshed a pear until his hands bled, wanting to become stronger and constantly repeating to himself that he would not bend to fate. Yue grouped himself and told himself that he couldn't run away from danger forever. Sean ran towards the two, which only provoked the fighter, and he also rushed towards the guy. Yue was close to the two and dodged a lightning strike with a knife. Bending down and avoiding another blow, Sean decided that he needed to exploit the two's weaknesses. Yue used his fist, but halfway his hand was caught by the hand of the Deuce, many times larger. Deuce laughed at the guy, shouting to him what kind of blow this was, and then Shan realized that it was rubbish. Deuce shouted whether the guy was mocking him and threw the boy above him in the air like a toy. Shan fell on his back and then rolled some distance around the ring. While Yue was getting up from the floor, the two shouted that the guy turned out to be just a stinking rat who only knows how to dodge. Deuce threw the knife over his shoulder and was very pleased with how he managed to hiccup the guy. The kings of the ring were confused, and every now and then turned to Chin to ask why the guy had just been strong, and now he had weakened so sharply, and whether this could mean that he had some kind of ace up his sleeve. And while in the ring, the public's interest in the new fighter was just flaring up, someone's shadow appeared near the garages where the guys lived in the exile zone. The man, whistling a melody, slowly approached closer and closer to the garage doors. The stranger knocked on the door twice, thereby waking up the sleeping Achun. The guy asked who was behind the doors and asked if it was Shan Yue. There were 4 people left on the podium, and while Yue was trying to gather himself together and a twosome was heading towards him, then to the side of them, a trio who still had a pistol swung his hand and threw something towards the fighters. Shan raised his head up and tried to look at the object that the troika threw. A small object was flying towards the drone from which the live broadcast was being broadcast. Yue was able to see in this object the same small bomb that they were given at the beginning of the game for the collar. Shan's face darkened from the understanding of what would happen next with the explosives. And the third, shortly after the throw, fired a shot in the direction where the Deuce and 4 were located. A powerful explosion occurred above the heads of Shan and the 2, and the announcer, only in a commendable manner, told the third how vile it was, and added that this was to be expected from a player with the highest rating. The Deuce received a severe burn and stood covered in smoke, covering his face with his hand. The third was rejoicing that the smoke would now clear and he would see Yue dead. But the 4th emerged from the smoke alive, although wounded and stunned after the explosion, and the 3rd could not believe his eyes, how the guy was able to dodge the bullet that was flying straight at him. Shan was stunned by the explosion and held his head with one hand, which was hiding the blood. The 3rd one was attacked with all his might by the 2nd one with terrible burns, and the anger became even greater from the pain. The 2nd was able to knock the pistol out of the 3rd's hand, and the weapon rolled straight to Yue's feet, spinning. A fight broke out between the 2nd and 3rd, and they tumbled around the ring and laid each other on their shoulder blades. The 3rd was dominated by physical strength, while the 2nd was already exhausted and wounded, which the troika noticed, and without even taking the knife from the opponent's hands, simply began to press it on the body. The 2nd understood that his strength was running out and turned to Shan and yelled for him to take the gun. The second frantically shouted to the newcomer to take the gun and shoot at the third, but Yue only indifferently remained in place and looked at his rivals. To save his life, Deuce was already shouting that he would let Sean win, and that he would give him part of the money, and the knife was getting closer to the body. The third finally told the two that he was a fool, and leaning with his whole body plunged the knife into the heart. The second could no longer breathe, but only wheezed, choking on blood, and rolled his eyes and died immediately. The third got to his feet, and looking at the second said that he was very sorry because the guy was not bad. Troika stared at Sean, saying that he was next, but at that moment a pistol shot sounded. The third looked down at the hole in his body that was already oozing blood, but did not make a sound and did not grab the wound. The next 3 shots hit the head and torso, causing the third to lose his balance and begin to fall. The pistol ended up in the hands of the first one, who, no longer in himself, shouted that 300,000 would be his. The third fell loudly and dead to the floor of the ring right next to the second. Out of 7 participants, only 2 remained in the arena, and all this was seen live by the audience both present and on the broadcast. The Walking Dead Club Arena was the largest and most colorful attraction in the prefecture. The battle was broadcast on one of the skyscrapers, where all the remaining participants were visible in close-up. A man in a strict and respectable suit was just watching what was happening on the big screen. The stranger looked at Sean and told him not to dare to die, and activated his power, which emitted purple electrical discharges. At the same instant, the glass in the street lamps burst due to overvoltage, and they went out. It was as if the power that man used began to cover the prefecture like a dark wave, and the light began to disappear as it approached the arena. People watched as all the electronics in the city crunched from overvoltage and crashed, showing an error or stopping working altogether. This massive shutdown and explosions of light sources were not only external, but also internal, causing some people to be injured. The prefecture sparkled with purple discharges and went dark, which ultimately led to pitch darkness except for the main source of light in the arena. This man was happy with the work done, as if nothing terrible had happened, but just some ordinary thing. Sean, although weak, told the first one that he would not receive any money. The first was little concerned about Yue's statement, since his main argument was the pistol in his hand, and he asked how the unarmed fourth was going to fight in such a case. Sean admitted to himself that he really couldn't win in such a situation, but he was not going to give up. The announcer noticed that Yue was getting up from his knees, and bringing the camera closer to him, announced to everyone that the fourth would fight to the end. The first one took the pistol with both hands to make the decisive shot, and the announcer only urged him on in this. But Yue, realizing that it was not so easy to go so far and Chun was waiting for him at home, decided to continue the fight no matter the cost, and then a shot sounded. Shan closed his eyes and took a deep breath, concentrating and sharpening all his senses. The guy felt a bullet flying in his direction straight to his head and caught a barely audible smell of rust in the air. Right before the bullet hit Yue's head, he quickly dodged it. The announcer could not contain his surprise and shouted to the first one whether he was even able to finish this fight because the enemy was so close. But the fighter missed. The first one began to chicken out from what he saw, and the gun fell out of his hands, and he stammered and asked how the fourth one was able to dodge the bullet because they are both at the lowest rank. Shan felt dizzy and weak, but the guy told himself that it was too early to pass out. The first, unable to stand being in this arena, wanted to quickly finish with his opponent and muttered the word die through his teeth. The first had a knife in his hand and screaming, he rushed at the fourth to finish him off. But Sean decided that he needed to survive, which means he chose to fight, and thus he again dodged the blow thanks to his strength. Now Yue could smell the rust more clearly, and noticed that the first one was already quite weak and was attacking in a state of shock, so the guy struck under the jaw. The fourth understood that if he was fast enough, he would be able to guess the moment and win, so with one hand he grabbed the first by the hand, and with the other he took away the knife and swung it. The knife was a couple of centimeters from the first one's neck, and Yue also didn't forget about the timer that was almost expired. Only the fourth did not kill the first, but only froze with a knife at his neck. The guy felt someone with incredible power heading into the arena. The scoreboard, meanwhile, showed the last 4 seconds before the end of the fight. The kings of the ring sat at the screen and screamed why this kid wouldn't finish with the first one, because there was only so much time, and Chin just continued to watch but also did not hide his misunderstanding. The screen on which the broadcast was broadcast in the king's room went out and purple sparkles came from it. Chin looked at the exit from the room and thought that this was not just a power outage. In the dark corridor of the arena, the confident and even step of the one who was involved in turning off the lights was heard. Chin realized that this is a certain person who has the ability, and right now, he is heading towards the ring. At the last second, the main ring board went out, and the participants remained standing in the arena. Sean held a bomb in his hand which also sparkled, and did not understand why it was removed. While the first fell on all fours and muttered to himself that he was saved, the fourth at that moment felt that it was not yet time to let down his guard because someone was coming here. A worker opened the grid and told the participants that they had some problems with energy, so the end of the competition was postponed and asked them to go back to the rooms and wait for the announcement. Sean silently backed away after the worker, but the first one still did not calm down and bombarded him with questions about who would win and where the money was and who would receive it, and whether it would be possible to divide it, into which the guard said that management would negotiate the reward. Yue stopped right next to the culprit of all this chaos, who was already waiting for the guy. The man in the suit praised the young man that he had done a pretty good job, causing mute surprise on the guy's face. The stranger smiled and asked if the guy wouldn't even thank his savior. Sean could barely look at the so-called savior with one eye, and he wanted to ask a question but could not. The guy's strength suddenly left him and he fell face down on the floor as if dead, and the man was indignant at what a weakling the kid was. The security guard stood and asked the audience to leave the room, and a man with Yue on his shoulder passed by him. The employee turned to the person who he was and asked to lower the participant to the floor because they could not leave the club. But the man continued to walk, ignoring the requests, and the employee, holding the stranger's shoulder, repeated that the guy was the property of the club. With a slight movement of his hand, the man slammed the guard into the wall and finally said that participant number 4 was no longer the property of the club. The kings of the ring, including Qin, heard and saw all this, and one of them asked Tian what he thought about what happened. Qin looked after the leaving man and replied that the wind had changed, and thought to himself that perhaps that child with the black ring was the key to changing this world. The king of the ring looked at the guy moving away from him and hoped that they would meet again. At the entrance to the prefecture, there was an expensive car, rather unusual for these places. And in the gateway, the scum were already waiting for their boss's command to rob the car, but the leader was just watching. A stranger was sitting behind the wheel and Shan was lying passed out in the front passenger seat, which already rather annoyed his savior because he was sitting waiting for the guy to wake up. The savior decided to speed up the process of awakening the young man, and the car sparkled from the current discharge. The stranger's plan worked flawlessly and Yue woke up, but his hair stood on end. The young man finally woke up, opening his eyes wide when he saw in front of him the one who had caused trouble in the club, and began to ask questions who he was and why he brought him here. Sean has already realized that this is the owner of the ability by the fact that he cannot move from the pressure he feels being next to him. The guy concluded that the owner was definitely of the highest level, if not special, but he was interested in the question of why he needed to save such trash as him. After all, Yue saw with his own eyes how such people trample and play with the life of scum as they want. Although Sean really wanted to ask the owner a lot, he decided that it was better not to get involved with him and tried to carefully open the car doors. Of course, it was not possible to do this silently, and the owner introduced himself as Lu Chuan, thereby forcing the guy to freeze in place. Sean seemed to hear something familiar to himself, and the attempt to remember was successful since the Liu family is the third among the 8 great families, and the guy thought about the ring on Zi's neck. Liu, as if reading Yue's thoughts, showed a gold ring under his shirt, indicating to the guy that his train of thought was correct. Zi sharply pointed his finger at Sean and told him not to even think about running away, since from now on the guy's life is in the hands of the owner. Liu looked at the guy's bright sapphire eyes and called him God's child. Liu explained that behind the legend above the special class, there was another more impressive divine class, and one person from the divine class was superior to 100 people from the special class due to the concentration of abilities. The existence of a representative of the divine class was similar to the name of their category, that is, they were equated to gods. Sean answered Zi that he had heard about the legend and about a person with a divine class named Liu Song, and Liu immediately replied that the same Liu was his great-great-grandfather. Yue began to compare the information logically, that if he is a divine child, then he is the child of Liu Songting, and he in turn is the great-grandfather of Liu Chuan. And in horror, Sean covered his mouth with his hand and quietly asked if he was Liu's great-grandfather. Liu threatened the guy not to talk nonsense and indicated that the legends he had heard about the divine class were not entirely true. Zi showed 3 fingers and said that since the appearance of the first holder of the ability, 3 people with the divine class were known. Liu, of course, talked about all three, naming the first great-great-grandfather Liu Songting, the second was Lady Wu Yue, who had the gift of foresight and immortality, and the third person disappeared after being recognized as a divine class. Z pointed his finger at the guy and said that Shan is the child of the owner of immortality Wu Yue. Shan smiled, taking it all as a joke, and asked Liu if he really wanted to say that the guy did not belong to the scum. But the smile abruptly disappeared from Yue's face when the memory of that dream that he constantly had came to mind. Shan asked himself the question that the woman from the dreams turned out to be his mother, and Liu, seeing the guy's stupor, said that he understood that a lot of questions would arise in the near future and promised that he would gradually answer everything, but for now, it was important to ensure safety. Z explained to Shan that his face was broadcast throughout the jurisdiction, which is why they would soon learn about the guy in the heavenly city. God found it amusing to talk about such things, and smiling, he told the boy that there was very little time left before those who wanted to kill him began to appear, and this was an omen of the beginning of a new war. The guys finally moved, driving through the streets of the exile zone. Liu periodically glanced at the guy, realizing that he still would not accept the truth that had befallen him 18 years later. Z asked Shan why he took part in the battle, because a guy should be aware of the limits of his strength, to which Yue replied that he needed money, but Liu did not understand why. Without answering his savior why he needed money, the guy asked him to stop instead. The guys approached some hardware store, and a man with an eye patch displeasedly asked Shan whether he had brought money this time, to which he replied in the affirmative. Yue looked at Liu, and the savior was surprised and asked if he looked like money, to which the guy quite reasonably replied that Liu had taken responsibility for the boy. Z looked at the seller and said to give the guy the best, from which the man's menacing look changed to terribly pleased. While the seller was packing the best prosthesis, Shan explained to Liu that he had a friend with whom he grew up, and his name was Ah Chun, and his class was below standard, so he did not need to stay in the zone. But because of Yue, the friend took advantage of his disability to stay. The young man also finally explained to his savior that he wanted to win the match in order to buy his friend's hand, because with it, Ah Chun would be able to move normally and get a job in the jurisdiction. The seller gave the prosthesis to the guy, and Liu at that moment looked at the child and thought to himself whether the boy knew that the tournament in which he took part would change so many human lives. Leaving the store, Liu reminded the guy that anyone he came into contact with could become their target, and added that if Shan cared, he would need to leave Ah Chun. Yo finally asked if he could return to Ah Chun and explain the situation before further actions were planned between him and Liu, and besides, the guy had many more questions. The savior agreed to the guy's last wish before changes in his life, and when they arrived at the garages, Z said that he would wait in the car. While Yue was walking towards the door, a bird flew onto the wall at the entrance to the guy's home and carefully watched the guy. Shan was in a hurry to see his friend, but was worried that he would scold him, because the guy looked rumpled, but it was still worth it. And having driven away thoughts of punishment and excitement, Yue was no longer eager to tell his friend about Liu and that he was a divine child. Yue was wildly happy imagining his friend's reaction to the gift of a new prosthesis. The guy raised the roller shutter and shouted to Ah Chun to wake up and see what Yue has for him. Shan walked into the dark garage without looking at his feet and was already beginning to tell his friend that he would never believe what he heard. But Yue fell silent, feeling that he had tripped over something on the floor, and began to look closely at the obstacle in the darkness. On the floor at the guy's feet lay his friend's completely disabled prosthesis, covered in blood. Somewhere from the depths of the garage came a sweet voice that said that the guy had finally returned and that he had been waiting for him, and Yue stood like a stone and looked at the prosthesis. A voice from nowhere continued to say that if I had not seen it with my own eyes, I would never have believed that the boy would hide in such a dirty place where no one with the ability would set foot, which is pretty smart. The man in the suit and silver collar snapped his fingers because to a large extent, all decisions were given to him that way. The light turned on, and before Shan's gaze, there was a killer sitting on the sofa with his foot standing on Chun's body, and this man said that it was an honor for him to meet God's child. Everything swam before Shan's eyes, and he looked at the dead body of his friend. Yue was torn apart from the inside, and he frantically shouted his friend's name, hoping that he would still hear him. The killer stood up, raising his hands up, and solemnly said that he found Yue first, so now he is closest to the deity. It became difficult for the guy to breathe, and he broke out into a cold sweat because he didn't even pay attention to the man but just looked at his friend. Just like on that ill-fated day when Shan almost lost his friend, this time the box fell from his hands to the floor again. Yue screamed loudly from the pain of loss, cutting through the air and not believing that he was now seeing what he was seeing. The killer just as indifferently stood with one foot on Chun's body and asked if the guy had such a reaction to this person. Shan, barely able to stand on his feet, ran up to his lying friend, and the man asked if the boy really knew him. Yue did not further notice the killer or what he was saying, but only scared his friend, saying that he had returned and asked him to wake up. The killer still stood and asked if the boy was crying. As befits a representative of the Silver Collar, he called the murdered Chun low-grade trash. The freak grabbed Yue by the clothes, calling him a useless loser, and lifted him up to face him. And the killer, asking if this non-entity, the heir to the deity, hit him in the ribs with his fist, saying that this was complete disappointment. The blow was so strong that Shan flew into the wall, leaving a dent and cracks in it. The tyrant raised his hand to use force and pull the guy's body towards him. Like a toy, Shan found himself near the Silver One, and he took the guy by the neck with ease. Silver was surprised that he really misrepresented himself, because the boy is such a weakling. But Yue didn't lean, because he understood that he could have dodged, and looked with eyes full of tears at his dead friend. At that moment, nothing else mattered to the guy in order to at least make an attempt to survive. Memories of his friend appeared before Yue's eyes, as if he was now standing in front of him, alive and cheerful as always. Choking from lack of air, Shan thought only about why it was not he who died. The strength left his divine child, but he did not resist but accepted his fate. The hand that had just been holding the killer's hand flew down dead. Shan felt that he was flying into some dark world that he had never seen before. The guy fell into the open doors from which two hands were already reaching out to him. Closing Shan's mouth and pushing him further into the door, exactly the same person appeared next to him. The other Shan confidently walked up the steps while the first one fell into the dark abyss behind the door. Finally, the new Yue looked at the falling old Shan with completely different eyes and told him that he was a coward. Shan tried to shout to the newcomer and asked him to wait, but the doors slammed shut. The killer's face lit up with a blue light, and this made him nervous. The guy, without raising his face, firmly grabbed the Silver One by the hand and removed it from his neck. The Silver One, spinning with terrible force, flew off as Shan had previously flown into the wall. New Yue took a deep breath and exhaled as if settling into his body after a long hibernation. The guy went to where the crippled Silver One lay by the sofa, whining in pain. The killer's head was covered in blood, and his hand was broken into smithereens, and he looked at her, realizing that the matter was rubbish. Before Silver had time to come to his senses, Shan was standing in front of him with a completely different strength. The killer tried to cry out for mercy and mumbled something about what he didn't want, but it was too late. Something strong was looking at the Silver One, the aura of which was completely different from what it was before. The scumbag held his hand, which had already turned blue, and lowered his head down. Objects in the garage began to float in the air, and the guy's clothes fluttered in the air. Silver shouted how he could screw up like that and wanted to use force against the guy with his whole hand. But Yue looked at the scoundrel with eyes dark as impenetrable darkness, and was not even influenced by the statement to go to hell. The Silver One's hand stopped right in front of the boy's face and froze like a statue. The bastard was seriously scared, feeling that his hand was not obeying him. Shan, using telekinesis, lifted absolutely all the objects in the room. The child flew up sharply and grabbed the Silver One by the neck, but didn't stop there. With a powerful blow, Shan threw the geek like a rag into the other end of the garage. Silver slammed into the wall so that blood sprayed out of his mouth, most likely from internal bleeding. Yue wasted no time in throwing absolutely everything he had picked up in the air at the killer. The bastard was sitting on the floor under the wall and began to dodge and hide from the boxes and cabinets flying at him. The guy still had a bunch of furniture and other rubbish in his arsenal, so he mercilessly continued to throw everything at the Silver One. This rag had no choice but to stand up in grief and run away to save his insignificant soul. Silver tore his claws and turned to the guy and realized that he had underestimated him because he was wearing a black ring, and it was necessary to finish him off right away. The bastard saw the exit from the garage and remembered that telekinesis has a range. Silver ran to the exit, thinking that as long as he increased the distance between them and went outside, the boy would not do anything. But at the entrance, the brat faced another obstacle in the form of an even stronger opponent. The owner asked the Silver One if he was really thinking of quietly giving up after creating such a mess here. The weakling looked at the lightning attribute as well as the scar on his face and the golden ring, which made him realize that Liu Zhichuan himself was in front of him. This moment of unexpected meeting was to Shan's advantage, and in the blink of an eye he found himself behind the Silver One. Yue used the power of telekinesis to grab his own neck with the bastard's broken hand and strangle him. The silver man's face turned white from lack of oxygen, and no matter how much he beat himself with his second hand, it did not help. The compression force was so strong that the neck broke and tore all the tissue inside. Silver remained on his knees, only his head was already hanging behind his back, and he began to look like a puppet without some of the strings. Liu continued to stand at the entrance sparkling, and Yue pushed the dead body to the floor with his foot. The one who came instead of the usual Shan stared at Liu and breathed heavily. Z smiled at the boy and asked if the guy would attack him too. Shan did not answer but only fell forward on his face, leaning slightly towards Liu. The powers dimmed and dissipated like smoke, and Yue lay completely immobilized. Z stood with folded hands and said to himself displeasedly that somehow he did not look like the savior whom they had all prophesied. The garage still stood open, but it was already quiet inside, and a lot of time passed before Shan came to his senses. The guy exploded as if from a nightmare, and the first thing he screamed was his friend's name. Yue sank, realizing that everything was actually looking at the body covered with a sheet. Then the boy drew attention to the entrance to the garage where Liu stood, and next to the locker lay the silver body. Z was smoking while waiting, and now, after taking a long drag, he looked at Shan and asked if he had woken up. Yue was terribly unsteady, and he could barely stand on his feet, but he still headed to the bed where his friend was lying. The guy opened the sheet and looked at the face of Ah-chun, whose eyes were apparently closed by Liu. Shan, overcoming the pain tearing him inside, silently lifted his friend's body. Yue's weakness was very strong, and without calculating this, he fell to the floor with Chun in his arms. Liu did not interfere but just stood and watched silently while continuing to smoke. Shan, carrying his friend in his arms, walked past Z onto the street, and the owner only glanced at them. The wind blew Yue's hair and ruffled Ah-chun's cloak, and if it weren't for what happened, one would have thought that Chun had just fallen asleep in his friend's arms. In the courtyard under a tree, Shan dug a grave and placed Chun's body there. Yue picked up a handful of earth to throw into the grave but was in no hurry to do so. Shan waited for some more time, sincerely hoping that maybe his friend would come to his senses after all. It was difficult to believe in this loss. But the earth itself slowly began to fall from the guy's hands onto Chun's already cold and pale body. After some time, the grave was filled up, and with it a very important part of Yue. The guy made a cross out of sticks, wrapped them with rope, and placed it on top of the embankment. When it was all over, Shan sat down in front of the grave like one continuous lump of pain. Yue hugged himself with his arms, tucking his legs to his head and leaning his face like that, looking at the grave with his sapphire eyes. Suddenly, a bright sun shone right next to Shan, and he heard a painfully familiar voice that asked how long the guy would continue to have this mournful look. The young man looked up and saw Ah-chun, who asked him to cheer up and was still smiling. Chun sat down next to Yue and put his hand on his head, ruffling his hair like a younger brother. And just as suddenly as this vision appeared, it disappeared, and Shan again sat alone, peering into nowhere. Yue was unable to restrain himself, and tears rolled onto the dry ground, leaving dark spots. The guy sat sobbing from the loss of his closest and dearest person, whom he could not save for the second time. Liu was already starting to doze off while sitting in the car when a boy knocked on his window. The owner lowered the window and, looking at his swollen face and dark circles under his eyes, realized that the guy was crying quite a lot. Yue himself decided to start an unfinished conversation by indicating that Ah-chong died due to the disclosure of his identity. Z confirmed that he would not give the guy any consoling speeches, and that indeed Chun's death was on his conscience, but added that Yue was not allowed to choose his fate, and especially now was not the time to feel sorry for himself since he needed to move on. Liu looked at the grave under the tree and warned Yue that something like this could happen again. But the owner also pointed out that if the boy does not want someone else to die, then he should become stronger and then change his fate and the fate of all people in this world. Shan nodded but sank even more from what was said, and in order not to prolong this moment longer, Liu told the boy to get into the car. Yue opened the door and turned to the house to take a last look at the place where he grew up. The guy's imagination pictured two playing and cheerful boys. The guys told each other some interesting things and both laughed loudly and cheerfully. The boys turned towards the one who represented them, and if Shan simply looked with his sapphire eyes, then Chun smiled as always. The friends held hands and waved to those who looked at them warmly and with friendly smiles. Yue was ready to cry again, but he already cried all he could at the grave, and now all that was left was to capture this picture. The guy overcame himself and turned around to get into the car, although he didn't really see the point in this. Yue mentally said goodbye to his friend, telling him that they would definitely see each other again. While the guys were driving in the car, Shan recalled how he clearly felt that his body was occupied by someone else, and Yue himself could only helplessly watch what the strongest was doing. The young man again imagined those eyes before the doors closed and noted that the strongest was very similar to him, but had the most powerful strength that would terrify even the gifted. Shan sadly remembered his friend lying on the floor and blamed himself for the fact that if he had been in his place, Ah Chong's death would have been avoided. The guy felt uneasy because the thoughts in his head seemed to no longer be his. Yue brought himself to his senses by hitting his legs with his fists, pushing away the stupid thoughts in his head. The guys continued to move around the exile zone by car, heading to their destination. Various scum kept looking at the car every now and before that they glanced slyly at each other. Shan asked Liu where they were going, and the owner answered briefly about the best place. Yo wanted to know what Z meant, and his savior replied that he was looking for a building with a good view that would be a base for them. Liu smiled and sarcastically remarked to the guy that he needed to change his dirty rags, to which Yue sarcastically responded with gratitude, and the owner sharply braked. The guy stopped at an impressive building on which a ferocious bear was painted, and Liu ordered the boy to climb out. The guys at the entrance were met by armed guards in the form of 2 people and asked what gang the uninvited guests were from, and Yue stood behind the owner and waved his hand at him, explaining that this was the Black Bear gang and they should leave here. Liu was only amused by the young man's fears and worries, and he smiled brightly while Shan mumbled about the fact that people call them black bears, and they are engaged in the resale of goods and management of the illegal production of prosthetics. Yue was still standing and quietly muttering something about the gang, but Z turned to him and, pointing his finger, ordered the guy to wait for him here and added that the boy's task was to protect himself. The blast waved through the guards far from the entrance, and the owner went on to clear the area. A bright purple light poured from the windows of the house and lightning flashed, and Shan stood and watched this, realizing that Liu's plan was successful. The electrical discharges were so powerful that Yue heard the crackling and crunching of lightning and realized that this would not end with just a bright light. The guy's suspicions were confirmed, and there was a loud explosion that blew out the windows. Like ants, the people of the Black Bear gang rushed from the exit of the base, shouting to run away because there was a gifted person in the room. Yue barely managed to withstand this crowd and covered himself with his hands, coughing from the smoke. Z came out and, standing at the door, waved to Shan to enter the new cleared home. The boy was shocked by how quickly and easily Liu managed, and completely trusting his savior, followed him inside. People from the gang stood blackened in the soot and tried to catch their breath while discussing what had happened, and came to the conclusion that if that gifted one appeared here, then something important would happen, and they did not ignore the boy. It seemed suspicious to the men that the guy who stood behind the gifted one had a black collar, and one of the gang decided to first go to the boss and figure out what to do about it. At the entrance to the arena stood the jurisdiction of many people, as well as their van with the doors open behind them. The commissioners brought someone with them in this van with special handcuffs on their legs and ordered them to get out of the car. A girl with a black ring and handcuffs on her hands got out of the car and looked at one of the jurisdiction. The girl was led to the place in the arena where Liu slammed the guard into the wall when he left, and a man in a suit and with notes in his hands was already standing next to the body. The subordinate sank next to the body of the guard, and at the moment when she put her hands to the head of the dead man, a glow appeared. The poor thing was cowardly, but she didn't remove her hands until she did what they brought her here for. One of the men looked like the leader among everyone, and he asked the girl if she had seen the attacker, and the unfortunate woman staggered, almost falling, and answered that she had seen. The prisoner was shaking, and she was covered in sweat, and catching her breath, she began to tell details about the golden ring and purple hair, as well as a rare electrical superpower. And at the end, she added that the man left with a boy who had a black ring. The leader found out everything he wanted and ordered the poor man to be sent back to the laboratory, which is what one of the men in uniform did, taking the girl by the hand. The girl could not take her eyes off the one whose thoughts she saw, but they told her not to hesitate and hurry up. It was not in vain that the subject looked in the direction of the guard, because he was already lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Representatives of the jurisdiction discussed outside that the young master of the Liu house was openly opposing the 8 main houses, but at the same time, nothing was clear about the boy because there were no clues, and the decision was made to report everything to the authorities first. Shan walked along the road with uncertainty and fear, and everything around him was covered in blood. Ah Chun's prosthesis lay in front of the guy again, and he shouted from somewhere far away, asking Shan for help and salvation. Yue rushed to save his friend, although he did not understand where to run, because everything around was red and blurred, and only the voice remained as a guide. Sean stopped because the silver one who killed Chun appeared in front of him, and in a vile afterlife voice he told the guy that he was trash. The silver one's face twisted in a terrible grimace and swam, and in an even more terrible voice he said that Sean was trash who killed his own friend. Yue screamed and jumped up, greedily grabbing air and opening his eyes wide, and his body was covered in cold sweat. The guy, putting his hand to his face, realized that he had just seen a terrible nightmare, and from the side, he heard a question from Liu whether the boy had woken up. Shan turned to where Zi's voice sounded, and seeing that he was watching TV, he asked why there was no sound, but Liu cynically asked whether it was really so incomprehensible, because he was watching the news that talked about them. The owner picked up the remote control and pressed the volume button several times. The news presenter was just talking about the fact that the investigation into the attack of the holder of the ability in the arena was still ongoing and invited the audience to look at the scene of the incident. Shan indifferently looked out the window where it was dark and only some lights were on, which made him wonder how long he had been sleeping. Z heard the boy's thoughts in the ear and said that it didn't matter how much he slept and could even continue to sleep for some more time, because then he would have no time to sleep so well. Yue asked the question directly, that those people about whom the owner spoke would soon come for him, and Liu replied that he really had no idea, because the fastest time for their arrival was the next second, and the slowest was a day or two. The savior asked the guy if he was afraid, and Sean didn't even know what to answer, considering that he never thought that he would live in the exile zone for so long. The boy remembered very well how he tried his best to live until tomorrow and did not at all expect that it would come. At such a young age, Yue realized that having a desire to live is both frightening and greedy, and remembering his friendship with Chun, he thought that despite all the darkness, there was a drop of good that made him want to live. Liu turned off the TV and looked at the boy, who was again lost in thought, without answering the question of whether he was afraid. The owner deftly launched the remote control directly at the young man's head to bring him to his senses, but all of Yue's senses were so dulled that he didn't even groan from the blow, but only rubbed his head and said that he perfectly understood Liu's strength, but he was worried about what they would do if the enemies attacked all at once. The boy embarrassedly added to his worries that he didn't want Z to get hurt, and this surprised the owner. Liu broke into a sly grin and told the boy that no one said that only the owner was on his side, and now Yue was surprised. Meanwhile, Z's phone showed a message about her and her boyfriend's coordinates in a temporary group chat, and 4 people saw it. The owner decided to express his thoughts out loud about the fact that he was interested in what choice the other 4 would make, namely, whether they would keep the promise made 18 years ago to protect or abandon the boy to his fate, or whether they would even go over to the side of the Lin clan. Sean listened carefully to Liu, and although he didn't know who he was talking about, he clarified about the choice, and whether Z really wanted to say that those 4 were not allies. The owner's face showed despondency and disappointment as he plunged into past memories. Z told the guy that at that time Mrs. Wu Yue was supported by 6 clans, and besides his Liu family, there were also Han and Zhou, Su as well as Pei and He. And Lady Wu Yue always believed that division into castes increases the evil of the human heart, and on this basis, she wanted to create a society where espers and people without abilities could exist. Wu Yue came to the decision-making center with a request to demolish the wall, after which a lot of indignation flew in her direction, that it was utter stupidity to live on the same land with low-ranking people, and those who supported Yue indicated that this was not a squabble for such outcries. The lady stood in front of the round table, waiting for an answer from the main leader. And after some time, Lin Shi asked the defenders of Yue who was the quarrelsome one here. Not wanting to lose power, the Lin clan started a war, enlisting the support of families from outside, and Mrs. Wu Yue sensed the impending danger and gathered all the ancestors who then saw baby Sean for the first time. That evening, the woman sat by the fireplace holding her precious treasure with sapphire eyes in her hands. Mrs. Wu Yue understood that her request was too selfish and dangerous, but she begged the heads of the families not to forget about their purpose. Yue justified her request with the explanation that as soon as they make concessions, the owners of the powers will become a threat to the existence of this world. And after 18 years of oppression, the Esper's contemptuous attitude towards the people will become even more cruel than at the moment. The lady believed that the wall was the border of 2 completely different worlds, and this border was the result of connivance with the exorbitant growth of the Esper's power. Lady Yue gave each head of family the right to choose that evening, only begging their families to save her child in the impending war. The mother leaned close to her child and said that he would soon fall into a deep sleep, but immediately assured everyone that when he woke up, he would definitely become the one who would restore order in this society. The baby, as if sensing his mother's anxiety, leaned against her and raised his arms to hug her. And after the failure in the first battle, the special ones began to increasingly strengthen control over the castes, committing inhumane actions. It got to the point that Lady Wu Yue was captured by the Lin clan, and everything materially that reminded her of her was burned. The pantheon suffered colossal changes, and behind it the 8 great clans were replaced as the Lin clan defeated the alliance of Wu Yue supporters. Already in his memory, Z knew that the Lin clan was watching their every move, so for 18 years, the descendants of those who took on the important mission had to pretend that they did not know each other even when they encountered each other in public. Liu ended his story by recalling how they could not make contact because they could not allow the Lin clan to reveal the plan. Z periodically glanced at the phone screen as if trying to make sure that the message had been read. Liu thought about how 18 years have passed and how many people there really are left who remember the plan. The owner somehow even became depressed, realizing that perhaps no one would show up at all, and he would have to figure it out alone. And now Shan looked at him carefully and said that he had disappointed Z. Liu confirmed the guy's fears and explained that he wanted to see a child from the deity stories who would change the world. But in the end, he met the most ordinary person and Yue wilted from what he heard. But Z immediately said that despite the disappointment, he does not regret that he came and surprised the boy. Shan smiled and got out of bed, thanking Liu, to which the owner only silently accepted it. Yue went to the door of the warehouse, saying that Z was most likely hungry, so he decided to look for something to eat. Inside the warehouse, there were a lot of food, drinks, and water, but the guy went inside and did not go to the food, but closed the door behind him and leaned on them. Shan slid down the door and sat on the floor with his hand to his head, feeling his weakness in front of everything that was to come. Yue sat with emptiness in his eyes and took his hand and ordered his body to stop shaking. The boy looked at his hand and his mother's words echoed in his head that when he awakens, he will definitely become the one who will restore order in society. Shan remembered how he lived on the street from an early age, almost in a box, and fled for his life, afraid of everyone and everything. I remembered how he almost lost his life while on the operating table where they wanted to disassemble him into organs and he ran away with an open wound. The guy's fresh wounds from the battles where he was thoroughly beaten up also made themselves felt. Even the fact that Yue saw how the bodies were thrown into the pit left a mark on his memory, and he seemed to be turning to his mother and admitted that he was not at all the child from her speeches who could save the world because he could not even protect himself. A silver bastard appeared before my eyes, humiliating Yue for crying over the death of a friend. And then nature took over, and the guy realized that he was not going to put up with everything, and, grabbing his clothes, he said to himself that although he doesn't know how many more espers will come for him, he doesn't have time to be afraid anymore. When Shan told himself that he needed to get ready, the floor under his feet shook as if during an earthquake. The young talent, as was typical for him, deftly dodged what he saw behind him. At the place where the guy was sitting, a stream of fire broke through the floor and hit the ceiling, turning into a pillar. Shan turned to the door with a silent question on his face, what the hell was going on, and where the fire came from. Meanwhile, Liu, calmly smoking a cigarette on the sofa, announced into the air that Pei Xinghuo had appeared, and given the noise outside the door, he wondered if the girl had become an enemy. And the guy kept dodging the fire as if it were a ball that continually chased him across the room. Yue realized that the flame was definitely hunting him, but he didn't understand how this was possible, and he was surprised that someone had determined his location with such speed, even though the guy didn't even see the face of the attacker. Shan ran behind the shelf and wondered if this was a flame that could sense an aura. The boy crouched down and breathed heavily, watching the fire from behind the boxes. Before Yue's eyes, the flame split in two for greater efficiency and shocked the guy. Shan just thought that he urgently needed to go to Liu when an explosion occurred and the temporary shelter was destroyed. The flames burned the boy, driving him more and more into a dead end both physically and mentally, which made Yue wonder if he could only rely on others. Shan came out of the shelter with his hand firmly grasping one side of the shelf. And with the thought that he was tired of constantly just running away, he overturned the cabinet onto the flames. The flame burst out from under the barrier, splitting into a bunch of tongues and flying up. The dancing lights burned toward the target standing in the middle of the room, and at that moment Yue decided that enough was enough. Shan concluded that the flame repeats his movements. so he needs to become invisible to him. The young man concentrated on hiding the aura, and then only a moment would be enough to find the source and catch the owner of the flame. Sean, defying himself in the flame, looked forward and was ready not to attack or flee, but to take the blow. The guy watched as fireballs approached him, and it would have scared anyone else and made him run. But Yue opened his eyes wide and remembered how Ah Chong taught him that by dodging, it is impossible to win. Shan remained standing in place, not resisting the attack, but completely accepting it. A huge explosion of flame burst out of the window, throwing sparks in different directions and rushing upward. Several sources of flame obediently returned to the owner who was standing on the roof. The lights, like tamed wild animals, flew near the mistress, and she stood and realized that she no longer felt the guy. But behind her, someone broke the silence with their landing, and the girl turned around. Yue landed on the roof covered in soot. Sweat was running down his face and his clothes and hair were burnt. Smoke emanated from the guy as if he were a pie that had just been taken out of the oven, and the girl standing in front of him carefully watched as he rose to his feet. Shan came to his senses only when he realized that he had not thought through his further actions, but it was too late because the guest came closer to him. The guy raised his head up and looked at the silhouette of the girl illuminated by the full moon. The mistress of the flame joyfully waved one of the sticks that was on her hair and said that the guy did a good job. Liu sat on the sofa all this time, waiting for what would happen next, without interfering in either the boy's fight with the fire or the acquaintance. But after the owner realized that everything was in order, and the boy still managed to do a similar trick with the aura, a smile appeared on his face. One part of Yue's hair stood on end and was burnt, and he barely managed to smile at the fact that Sinyo appreciated the maneuver he had performed. The young man could not rise to his full height because his legs did not support him at all, but he did not want to fall right in front of the guest because he had only just been recognized. When Yue began to lose strength and was leaning towards the floor, Liu arrived in time and grabbed the guy by the collar of his clothes. Sean was about to say thank you to his savior once again, but Z hit the boy at a certain point on the neck. Yue passed out from Liu's precise point strike, and the owner turned to Xingho with a request to talk, and the girl agreed. The guy was lying on the sofa, carefully covered with Z's jacket, who explained to Sinyo that extrasensory perception turned out to be just a quick reaction. Xingho ironically said that if such a crappy ability was inherited by Mrs. Wu Yue's child, then their future would definitely be filled with hope, and at the end she added that she would be returning home. Liu decided to convince the girl by explaining that when the boy resisted the surprise attack, he was able to briefly hide his aura in the fire when the flames consumed him, and then found the exact location of Xingho. The owner also added that even if someone else had dared, they would not have been able to do something like this. And Xingho again waved it off, saying that she had given in, and immediately asked why Liu had such a high opinion of the guy. He had seen something before her arrival. Z thought and remembered how this weakest boy broke the silver one's neck with his own hand using telekinesis. Liu smiled slyly and answered the girl that before her arrival there was indeed something interesting, and when Sinyo asked what exactly it was, she did not receive an answer. Instead of details about the guy, Z turned his attention to the girl, and reminding the two that they had not seen each other for 16 years, noticed that the girl trained a lot. Sinyo touched the scar on her neck with her fingers, exactly the same as on Liu's face, and replied that he too was not behind in training. The girl laughed, noticing that the man with the scar on his face would have said something about her, and Liu had nothing to object to. Sinyo looked out the window and noticed that dawn was soon, and it would be interesting to know who will appear next, who will be an enemy or an ally, and Liu decided to joke that the main thing is that whoever appears has a good tongue, and Sinyo was a little enraged by such a hint. The bird that once flew to the guy's garage before Yue returned from the battle flew to a tree growing near the pantheon of the meeting hall of the 8 clans. 2 men in formal raincoats looked out from the glass walls onto the street and discussed the fact that this meeting room had not been used for years, and then everyone showed up due to the fact that something serious might have happened. Another man, looking at the building, shared with his colleague that he still remembers the times of Lady Yue's reign, and that then this place radiated greatness because the best of all 8 clans were here. And now there are several monsters who are trying to pass themselves off as representatives of the clans. The first colleague asked to speak more quietly because the demons responsible for determining the location of the descendants of Yu are also espers, and the walls have ears. The man was right about the wiretapping, because at that moment 2 demons were watching them, and one of them said how he wanted to rip out the tongues of those talkers. The demon looked at the demoness standing next to her and asked whether she had such thoughts in her head or not. The demoness thought for a moment and later reminded her that she was annoyed by this, and asked again threateningly if she hadn't talked about this. The demoness warned her colleague standing next to her that if he got into her head again, he would lose his. The most important leader at the round table noticed the discussion between the demons and drew their attention to the need to return to the main issue. One of the demons looked rather warily at the others while they discussed the latest news. On the table screens and large screens on the wall, there were photos of Liu and Shan, and the main leader announced that everyone present must have heard about Liu Zhuchuan because the results of the assessment of his abilities made a noise. One of the demons voiced that if we take into account only strength, then Liu is the only Esper who is close to the divine rank. So I would not want to meet him face to face, and Demon SC, looking at Yue's photo, suggested sending half-bloods. Z asked if they raised half-breeds like cattle not for such an occasion. And after that, further looking at the photo, Shanya said that it was such a pity because she so wanted to taste the child of God. Looking through the holograms further, Z analyzed that Liu is not the only headache because there is also a defender, and in the photo was Pei Xinghuo. The photo of Xinghuo was taken just as she was heading to the coordinates for Liu and Shan. The demons began to be disturbed by such news, and this could be seen by the glances they exchanged and by their movements, but they still expected an answer from the chief. Lin ordered to send people to capture Shan Yue and bring him alive, and regarding Xinghuo, he gave the order to kill him. One of the demons reminded Lin what about the other 3 families that support Yue and the head, replied that they have not done anything yet. These creepy entities had all the information, and they began to look at each of the families, and one of them was the weapons master Su Ye, who disappeared 10 years ago, and since he did not leave any descendants behind him, there is nothing to be afraid of. The second person to come up for discussion was a gifted descendant of the Han family whose name was Shu. But Han Shu is constantly confined to a hospital bed and definitely won't be able to fight. That is, that also disappears. And finally, as for Zhou Shi, after the last battle, the Zhou clan sent him to a monastery to improve and moved away from him, and accordingly, he will need protection more than others. Lin instructed that his subordinates give the descendants of the families a warning that if they continue to hide, they will remain alive. But if they decide to support Liu Zhuchuan, then kill them all. The 3 demons disappeared, teleporting to where the 3 targets were located, that is, the descendants, and the remaining demons, and Lin remained. Demon. He noticed something behind him and turned around at the sound coming from the window. It was a bird that had already taken off and flown away from the conference hall. The bird flew to a mountainous area in which the forest densely embraced the monastery. The bird landed where a waterfall raged among the trees, and a man sat in the lotus position on a stone at the foot of the waterfall. It was the same Zhou Shi, and the bird that flew away from the pantheon landed on the guy's shoulder. The feathered assistant began to tweet what she learned into the ear of her owner, who listened attentively to her. She was surprised that the descendant of the Liu clan had already met with Shan Yue, and that Xinghuo was already on his way. The bird began to restlessly flap its wings and chirp louder, expressing its concern for its owner. Zhou Shi moved his assistant from his shoulder to his finger and looked at her carefully. She took his weapon and was about to leave, but before that he raised his hand in the air, helping the bird to take off, and convinced it to fly, and he could handle it himself. At that moment, the head of one of the demons sent by Lin appeared right out of the water. The house of the Su clan, although huge, was quite discreet and was also located in the mountains, so there was often fog there. The rooms of the home were quite minimalist but spacious, indicating a love of scale. The house was practically part of nature, since, in addition to the mountains, on the very territory of the building, there was a lot of greenery. The downside of this huge house was that there was silence everywhere because the owner was unwell. Demon Chen took over Su, and had already entered the house to convey a warning from Mr. Lin. And Han Shu lay in the hospital, and for a long time listened to the same cradle of the squeaking sounds of the life support machine. Wooden sticks, sharp as knives, moved close to the immobilized body. A demon had already arrived to Han Yu, with sharp branches coming out from behind his back, ready to pierce anyone at any moment. Morning came and Shan woke up from strange sounds outside the window, which also attracted his allies. The guy jumped up from the sofa and ran to Lu and Sino asking if there were enemies there, but the owner said that they were not enemies at all. Z looked down, concluding that in the lands of the exiles everyone is so arrogant that they overestimate their strength, and with so many people, they really want to take their lands from him. At the entrance of the base there were 2 vans, and in the yard itself there was a gang of 6 people, and the main one asked through a bullhorn if they could talk. Shan was very surprised to see Qin Tian below, who also wants to talk and not fight. Leo simultaneously shut the guy's mouth and moved him away from the window, answering the gang below that he had nothing to say to them. Chin smiled and said that he didn't want to talk to the owner at all, but to the pink-haired guy whom Z had dragged away. The King of the Ring added that this conversation was only between them with black collars, and then Yue was even more surprised. Sinyo, standing next to Liu at the wall, advised him to moderate his disappointment, and when Z asked if it was really so noticeable, the girl confirmed that it was very noticeable. The silence was broken by Liu's feigned evil laughter, and his words that his hands were terribly itching, and he wanted to finally see his real enemies, and lightning crackled around him, and Shino at that moment would really like someone to calm him down. In the room, Chin told the boy that he had not thought about such a quick meeting, but when he heard that the building was attacked by Esper, he immediately thought about Shang, and the guy immediately apologized. But Qian indicated that it didn't matter because he didn't come to fight for the land. Qin indicated that he was wondering why the special ones needed the guy, and Yue, looking away, said that if he explained, Qin wouldn't believe it. Meanwhile, each of the gang was doing his own thing on the street. One of the guys was indignant about why he could talk for so long because he was hungry, and the other was indignant in response that all he did was eat. The guy who played cards said that the boss doesn't worry about the people at all, driving Tiange back and forth between the lands of the exiled and the prefecture. Qin for himself once again repeated the boy's information that in short, he is a descendant of Lady Wu Yue, and he will have to confront the entire pantheon, and inquired about the guy's allies, only those two outside the door. Shan confirmed that these were his allies and could not understand how Qin knew his mother because he did not name his mother, and Tian asked a leading question. When was the day of the battle did Yue leave the lands of the exiled for the first time? And when the guy nodded, Qin explained that residents of other areas know the name of his mother, although all these years it was banned and could not be mentioned under any circumstances. Tian noted that the boy's frankness was amazing because they had met only once, and the King of the Ring said that he could go out the door now and reveal the location of the divine child to those who were hunting for him, and asked if Yue was afraid. Shan replied that Qin would not do such a thing because his intuition tells him that he can be trusted. And Tian clearly grimaced in bewilderment because Shan asked not to look at him like that because his intuition is quite accurate. Qin sarcastically asked if the guy's intuition really was like that, and in his head he thought that in just 2 days the boy's look had changed so much. The King of the Ring decided to give Yue a return gift for his honesty in the form of a lead that concerns his mother. Tian said that 20 years ago he got a job in the prefecture in the form of building a building. The important point was that the location and purpose of the object were classified, so Qing and the other guys were ordered not to remove the blindfolds until they arrived at the site. Tian, after some time, concluded that they were most likely building something like a prison. One day, while carrying materials for construction to the right place, Qin passed by doors that were not completely closed. Tian saw only one capsule in the huge hall and realized that the prison was intended for only one person. At some point, 3 men walked towards Tian, but not the workers who brought them here. The person walking in front, and most likely the main person, had a golden ring, and he turned to the 2 people behind it that everything needed to be finished as soon as possible. The workers shouted to the builders, among whom was Qin, to bow their heads and not stare around, but he still heard the chief say that they needed to finish with the cage for God. The king finished the story and voiced his thoughts that Shan's mother might still be locked in that prison, and he warned the guy that this was just his guess, but if it was true, then Mrs. Wu Yue was still alive. And in the house of the Su clan at that very moment, the demon was prowling around trying to find someone, but there was emptiness everywhere. The demon walked from room to room, but did not find anyone, and came to the conclusion that he did not sense anyone alive here. Like a ghost moving through the walls, the demon seemed to find himself in a shelter under a house or laboratory, but even then, not finding anyone, he decided that he could return. But Esper's attention was attracted by a closed door behind which he felt some weak energy. The demon leaked through the door and was surprised by what he found there. A picture appeared before Esper's gaze that he had never expected to see, which made him laugh, and he told himself that this could not happen. The demon looked at something similar to a person but completely robotic, and with a bunch of connected wires, which led to even greater misunderstanding because the Su clan had no descendants left. Most likely reacting to the movement and sound, the robot's unusually beautiful pink eyes opened, and Esper realized that he had woken him up. The machine started the process of updating data, which so far was 20%. So looking at the demon, the object was not yet identified. Esper continued to stand in front of the robot, and analyze out loud that he was without a collar, and therefore they did not know about his existence, and began to ask questions about who this guy is and how he is connected with Suye. The demon stared at the robot and indignantly asked if he was deaf, but the data update showed another 70%. The update completion signal sounded, and the machine's eyes showed 100%. Esper, not expecting absolutely any turn of events, continued looking at the robot with a silent question. The car remained motionless and looked at the demon in the same way as he looked at him, but at the same time the robot voiced two words to Chen Yan. Esper was not ready for this, and was shocked by what the machine said when it saw him for the first time. The demon was angry, and at the same time frightened by this situation, and he was already in an attack position, asking how the robot knew his name. The Esper used teleportation to get behind the machine and take it by surprise, shouting at him to answer the question. But the robot only turned, pointing his hand at the demon and firing from there a beam of the same color as his eyes. Chen was thrown back by the shockwave and blinded, and all he could do was save himself by teleporting again. In the place where the demon had just been, there was only a trail of smoke from the impact. All wires were disconnected from the robot, considering it to be in full combat readiness. Chen sat against the wall and covered the wound from which blood was oozing, and in his head there was only the thought of how this was possible. The demon realized that the directed shockwave emanating from the palm was the ability of the deceased Esper Luo Xingguang. Chen stood up but could barely walk, but he understood that something was wrong here, and they had completely different information, so he urgently needed to report to the others because Wu Yue's minions were not so simple. A bright pink fog appeared behind the demon, and the one who was usually feared was now terrified. Chen understood that the matter was rubbish and tried to leave as quickly as possible. But it was already too late, and the robot, standing close to the demon, held his hand behind his back. Lin's henchman finally only managed to say the word no, looking somewhere ahead, realizing that this was the end. A powerful beam of light was activated from the robot's hand, which was accompanied by the demon's scream. Zhou Shi was also visited by a demonic guest who appeared before him straight from the water. The demoness, using her power, lifted a large amount of water into the air, and using it as a weapon, launched it at Esper C, screaming for him to die. Shi remained level and just waited for the water to come close enough. The Esper put his hand in front of him, and without saying a single word, stopped the huge drops of water. The water lost the color of the demon's power and became as transparent as always, and Shi began to control it with ease. With his hand, the guy swirled the water into a beautiful whirlwind that flew up like birds. The demoness decided that she would calmly defeat the one who makes birds out of water, so she hurried to attack Zhou, but despite his careless appearance as a monk, he repelled blow after blow without giving the enemy a break. The decisive blow was Shi's last blow, with which he launched the demoness's body high into the sky. And while the body was flying in the air, Zhou himself deftly moved through the water straight to where it should fall. The demoness fell with terrible force onto the stone surface so that blood clots flew out of her mouth. But Ji had already arrived at the enemy from above, holding his weapon at the ready to finish what he started. And holding his head with a scabbard, Zhou placed a sword in front of them like a guillotine to cut off the head. The demoness, choking on blood, tried to find out what ability the descendant of the Zhou clan used. The guy looked carefully at the enemy and replied that he never uses Esper's abilities in battles with weaklings. In the monastery, a huge statue of Buddha was entwined with tails of incense smoke that were used for meditation. The monks sat like carbon copies facing the divine in long rows, and some of them prayed, and some held singing bowls in their hands. The students' voices merged into a single stream, creating a powerful vibration wave. One of the prayers and teachings was that an unsullied heart, like pure water, reflects everything without distortion, but a heart absorbed by worldly passions like muddy water cannot comprehend the true nature of reality, the body of the Buddha Dharma. The water washed not only the young man Shi, but also his sword from the dirty blood of the enemy who wanted death in the name of power. Zhou Shi stood over the dead body of the demon on the stone where he had originally meditated, and the water near the stone was colored with blood and carried it further downstream. If Shi had already dealt with the uninvited guest, then Han Shu was still in danger because he was vulnerable. The demon decided to check whether the young man's body was really immobilized and raised his hand with its wooden tentacles. Squeezing Han Shu's hand, Lin's henchman concluded that the intelligence was right and the guy was no more dangerous than an ordinary corpse. The demon lifted the descendant's golden ring with one of the branches and looked attentively. The demon made a cut on Shu's hand and found it rather pitiful that such a talented awakened one had to lie in a hospital bed forever. Thin streams of blood flowed down the young man's arm from the wound and drops fell onto the floor. The demon took advantage of the wound it made, and by attaching one of its appendages to the arm, began to absorb blood. As expected from a special rank, the demon was flooded with memories from what he had absorbed along with the blood. Some sounds were heard behind Lin's henchman, and as he stood with his head thrown back, tasting blood, he looked back. From the hands of the one who entered Shu's room, a box of apples fell onto the floor. A sweet little girl with a large white bow on her long golden hair screamed for the demon to quickly move away from her brother. The enemy was so indifferent to the child that he remained standing, and moreover had the audacity to answer that he did not want to leave. The baby did not stand on ceremony and, rising into the air, grabbed the wooden branches of the demon with both hands, which he did not expect at all. The girl made a throw and threw the uninvited guest across the room right out the window. The young talent immediately ran to his brother to check if he was safe. But she didn't have long to stay near her brother, and one of the tentacles pierced the baby's shoulder. The demon repeated what the girl did to him and, holding her with a shoot stuck in his shoulder, hit him against the wall. The enemy mocked the girl, calling her a careless little sister, and pulled out a tentacle from her shoulder, causing the little girl to collapse to the floor, covering the wound that was bleeding with her hand. The demon twisted Shu's body and jumped out through the already broken window, not paying attention to his sister's screams. Although the girl was wounded, she deftly jumped over the balcony fence in a hurry to save her brother. The little girl shouted to the villain to stop and landed on the ground with such power that it cracked, and the enemy actually stopped, but not because of the girl's threats, but because they were already waiting for him. The Han family, led by their mother, met the venerable ghost, and Mrs. Han still warmly addressed the demon that he should have warned him in advance about the visit, and they would have prepared a reception. Lady Han smiled sweetly at the uninvited guest and said that she just didn't understand why everything was so complicated. The ghost felt that all this mercy was feigned, and his interest in the mistress's further actions only warmed up. Lin's henchmen indicated that they knew that the Han family was still loyal to the Wu Yue family, and at that moment, everyone who stood behind Lady Han was ready to attack, but she, being even, further showed them with a hand gesture to stop and listen further to the demon. The enemy continued to explain that perhaps the Han family knew what stupidity Liu Chuan had done, and he came here to warn the family not to poke their nose into something that was not their business, and then they would remain alive and they would capture the heir of Wu Yue at any cost, and tied Shu more tightly. The color of Mrs. Han's eyes changed to a more pronounced one, and she made it clear to the bastard that she did not care about other people's offspring, after which, for the time being, she politely asked to let her son go. The demon, twisting Shu's body more tightly, raised it higher and mocked whether Lady Han really meant this lifeless thing. And if the family stood in anticipation that everything would be decided by conversation, then the ghost, according to its nature, committed a dirty trick and said that if the lady values her son so much, then let him catch him, and Shu threw him like a toy into the air. The little sister sat on the cracked ground after the jump and all the time watched what the adults were doing. But then little Li reacted to her mother's cry and understood everything without any other words. The sister activated her power and rose into the air in flight, catching the body of her brother. The demon took advantage of the fact that everyone was distracted by Shu and teleported away, satisfied with the work done. Madame Han, without turning around, explained to everyone that there was no point in chasing the ghost, but that it was better to take Shu back to the ward. Li sat on the ground and held her brother in her arms, but she was told that her wounds also needed to be treated. But her daughter, without raising her head, asked if her mother was serious when she said that she didn't care about other people's children and that their family would really sit idly by. Having not received an answer, the girl in her hearts told her mother the words of her brother, that he always spoke about the power that is given to the awakened to change the world for the better. And although Li did not understand much, she saw that their world was getting worse. The girl could not understand why her mother was so polite to the impudent man, even after he so carelessly grabbed her brother, but Mrs. Han remained silent. One of the assistants turned to the young mistress with a request to return inside because even the walls have ears. But the little girl could not understand why her mother was silent. Faced with silence in response to her misunderstanding, Li leaned closer to her brother and answered for herself that she still understood one thing. Tears welled up in the little girl's eyes, and she realized that she herself would fulfill the will of her older brother. Mrs. Han nevertheless approached her daughter and restrainedly reported that Li had made 2 mistakes at once during the battle. While the girl rose from her knees, the mistress looked at the broken window and explained that the first mistake was when Li did not make sure that the enemy was dead, thereby giving him a chance to injure himself. The second mistake is that, realizing that a loved one needed help, The young lady hesitated before making the right decision, and Lee asked whether it was really that important. Mrs. Han was no longer looking somewhere but at her daughter. And to the girl's question about the importance of mistakes, the mother replied that it was not important, and that was just her answer. Meanwhile, at the base where Yue was staying, the guy and Qin continued their dialogue. Shan asked Tian to describe the place in more detail, and he asked if the guy meant a divine rank chamber, to which he received an affirmative answer. Qin made a thoughtful look on his face and began to explain that the place looked like a cage around which there were pillars, and in the middle there was a capsule, under which there was something similar to a pool. Tian also pointed out that the liquid in the pool was like lava, and that he still remembers that sharp, sickening smell, after which he drew attention to the guy who sat with his head down looking at the floor and did not even respond to his name. Indeed, at that moment in Qin's story, Shan was looking at the floor and imagining how there was lava under his feet, and the fighter's words were flying in his head and echoing. Yue did not understand what had happened, and this made him feel even more uncomfortable, and his heart was terribly pounding. At some point, his mother appeared in front of the young man and asked in an eerie voice whether Shan was capable of doing something alone. Yue called his mother, but she sat down on the chair opposite, smiled, and asked to give her his body. The guy at that moment gave way to ferocity and realized that this was not his own mother. In a completely different voice, the deceitful face of the mother replied that the boy had guessed right, and the image began to disintegrate even more. Instead of Mrs. Wu, a guy with different eyes appeared, who once inhabited the body, and now, pointing a gun at a weak version of himself, introduced himself to the boy as Shan Yu. The strong version, without hesitation and without saying anything else, shot the weak one in the head. Qin jumped up from his seat and looked at the guy who was lying with his head thrown back but did not react to the fighter's cries. Tian ran out into the corridor and called Xingho and Liu, saying that something was wrong with the boy. Sino grabbed the boy by the shoulders and began to shake him, but the sight was so pitiful that his head might just fall off. Shan looked ahead with his eyes wide open, but he saw not Xingho but a strong version of himself. While both versions were conducting a dialogue, nothing helped the boy wake up from this bad dream in reality. Both versions again stood at the door that apparently led to the mind. The stronger one held the weak one tightly by the hand and continued to tell the guy to give him the power of the body. Shan felt this terrible power, which is why he could not move his body as if he was chained. The strongest leaned towards his weaker version and asked if the guy had forgotten that he himself had called him. Shan raised his head to the strongest, and he continued to say that when Ah Chong was killed, and the guy turned out to be so pitiful that he could not do anything to the enemy, then Strong Yue replaced that frightened kitten. The Strong extended his hand forward and argued that only he could win the upcoming war, and then asked Shan to give up this body, and the strongest would complete their mission. Yue resisted the power of the other, but realized that his power eclipsed everything he had ever seen, and it was like a deity. The strongest, like a mirror, approached Shan's face and asked the guy to simply say that he was giving him his body, but Yue resisted, and then the deity again called the young man a coward. Other Yue let go of the hand of his weak version, because sounds similar to voices began to be heard from behind the doors, and he, being dissatisfied with this, said that someone was always interfering in their conversation. Shan was returning to his place, but everything was swimming in his eyes, and the voices of the owners and Qin were muffled. And Liu, releasing sparks from his hands, joked about Xingho that his electricity turned out to be much more effective than her fire, and the girl was worried that the guy's brains would not turn into mush from the discharges. Qin also wondered if the guy was okay and if he could hear them, but against the background of the voices of living people, Yue heard the last phrase of the strongest version, which said that they would meet again, and this made him scream loudly. And along with the cry, Shan grabbed the first hand that came his way in order to also grab hold of reality. Yue breathed heavily while continuing to hold Liu's hand, which plunged everyone into shock and misunderstanding. The boy raised his head, looking at the owner with his sapphire eyes, and addressed him by name. Liu reacted and asked what happened, but before that he muttered that it was Sinho's idea to shock the guy, and the girl, having heard this, had already prepared one of her sticks, asking if Z had not received blows for a long time. Shan, still holding Liu by the hand, shouted out a request to him to fight with him. Z said out loud that he definitely went too far with the tension, while Xingho, trying to find out if the boy had a fever, put one hand on his forehead and the other on him, but Yue replied that he was fine. The young man explained his strange request by saying that he needed his awakened power, and the only way to get it was through battle. Shan looked at the owner with all determination, and Xingho and Liu looked at each other, realizing that this could end badly. The guys went to the corner of the room and leaned against each other, barely holding back their laughter, and Sinyo, covering her mouth, said that the guy was cutely naive, and Liu said that his request was even a little insulting. The owners, standing in the corner, whispered that training would be useful for the boy, but Sinyo immediately threatened Liu to save energy, from which he laughed and said that there would be no need to strain himself because he was a weakling, and Yue replied that in fact he could hear them. Qin turned to the guys with the news that he knew a suitable place for sparring. Everyone arrived at the huge port base, and compared to the containers that stood there, the people were like ants. Sinnoh was not particularly happy about this idea, but on some side, having her own strength, she understood what Yue was asking for. No matter how strong and cruel the girl was, she was worried about the boy and asked him to try not to die. But Shan, in turn, replied that this is exactly what he needs, because only when he is on the verge of death will he get what he needs. Yue was determined, saying that he had to become stronger for so many reasons. The fighters stood opposite each other, and Sinyo, watching this, thought that it seemed she had made the right decision when she decided to support the divine child. Liu, as always, stood in his relaxed manner and looked at his ward, but Shan had already taken a defensive position. Yue had already analyzed where Z would attack from, and whether he would do it at a distance or go into close combat, and calming himself, the guy set himself up to focus and follow the movements of the owner. Liu laughed because he found it amusing to watch the boy's seriousness. And while Shan was thinking through battle tactics, Z had already prepared an unexpected turn of events, offering to give this place a more presentable appearance and used his power. A dome of honeycombs began to form above the fighters, causing the guy to even lower his hands while looking up. The dome closed like a huge lid, raising dust and a wave of wind, which made Shinho worry even more. The girl, knowing full well that the outcome could be fatal because Liu's strength is great against the still weak guy, ran to the dome. But the dome was created using Zhe's electrical power, so Xingho was thrown back. The owner looked at the dome, and all she thought about then was Shan. The fighters looked at each other carefully, and there was no hint of fear on Shan's face. Liu extended his hand charged with energy forward, and asked the boy to watch carefully because he would show him who the real awakened one was. And before the fight, he asked if Yue was ready to shed some blood. Shen grouped himself even more and silently made it clear that he was ready for battle. The guy wanted to use his ability to quickly move, but did not at all expect what happened. Liu appeared next to him with such speed that Yue's hair flew back from the gust of wind. All Shan managed to do before attacking the owner was to ask himself in his head how Z did it. Not sparing the guy, Chuan slammed him into the asphalt with a powerful and charged blow. Yue lay blackened and sparks were still emanating from him, and in his head there was only an understanding of how fast Liu was. After all, it was impossible to even see any movements. The young man reached the point where he was almost dead to meet his strongest version. Before Shan plunged into himself, he saw Z walking towards him, and he thought that the owner was still using only one hand. Chuan broke into a sly smile and asked the boy to try harder because they were just warming up. Shinho's flames raged outside in an attempt to open the dome, but to no avail. Qin, observing everything, noticed that throughout his life he had seen a lot of awakened ones, but he had never met anyone like Liu Chuan, and Xingho, exhausted, agreed with the fighter. The girl also confirmed Qin's words, and said that at this time there is no one who is closer to the divine rank than Liu Chuan. Xingho plunged into memories of how she saw Liu 16 years ago at the day of assessment of the awakened ones. Chuan was in a special cell, number 97, and even though the room was closed, sparks of his power went beyond the security door. The people who were nearby at that moment experienced terrifying pressure and could not believe that the power of the awakened could be so powerful. The board above the camera was supposed to calculate how close Liu Chuan's strength was to rank. The system could not specifically determine Liu's strength, so the image showed an eye with the same color as Lady Wu Yue's ring. Little Shinho stood with the others and watched what the system would show, while people angrily shouted that this couldn't happen. And for unknown reasons, the system nevertheless highlighted the golden rank of the awakened, to which people were now whispering indignantly that they had said that this would happen. The cell door rose, and clouds of smoke were the first to emerge from there, and the room itself was black with soot. Compared to the place outside where everyone else was, the cell was pitch black. The room was illuminated only by a boy who came out glowing with a violet flame and sparks of the same color. People applauded the young talent, but not because of his high rank, but more out of fear. Xingho then looked at Liu and was truly amazed by his abilities. Those accompanying the young lady said that now it was her turn to show what she was capable of. Sinyo then entered the cell with only one thought, that she would never lose to that boy. The girl was brought back from her memories by the touch of her scar on her neck and the silver ring, as well as Chin's question about what happened. Z was gifted since childhood. The question was rhetorical, and Tien concluded that since Liu is so strong, Shan has no chance of survival. The girl explained that she wasn't worried about Yue, and the real reason was that the enemies could attack at any moment, so they need to be alert to hold their position because if they appear before the end of the guy's battle, the consequences could be dire. Qin told Xingho that they can rely on him since he will guard the entrance, and if anything happens, he will inform them immediately after what was said. The girl asked why the fighter was helping them. Tien gave a completely reasonable answer that, at the moment, there are a large number of exiles awakened in the zone who are interested in the divine child, and this only means that the guy is important to such an extent that he is able to change this world. The King of the Ring finally added that all of them are black rings, including him, who are eager for this world to change, even if it means sweating on the boy's side. Without turning around, Qin said that he would let you know if something happened. Shan was lying on the ground trying to get up, but his strength was leaving him. And before the meeting, he thought that he was very grateful to the gods for having Liu Chuan on their side. Another moment, and Yue felt like he was sinking, and his body was becoming even softer and his eyes were closing. And the strongest appears right above him with the words that the guy already understands everything himself, that without his help, Shan is useless. Yue looked into those black, bottomless eyes and realized that he was disgusted to be in the presence of the other, because he was not talking about trust, but rather about something all-consumingly terrible. The strongest leaned towards Yue's ear and, like a snake, continued to say that he knew perfectly well what the guy was thinking about. It was as if the devil on his shoulder was convincing the guy of his supposedly false thoughts, that he was tired of being a weakling, and that he longed for strength that could overcome even Liu. The little imp stood in front of Shan and said to beg him for help, and continued to call the young man a pathetic coward who is not able to face reality, arguing that there is no point in resisting. It was a pure voice of fear, driving him into a dead end, repeating that isn't the guy afraid of what all those awakened ones will do if they grab him. Shan did not answer anything, and the other only added even more doubts, saying that fate is worse than death, and cited the example of a mother in captivity, trying to put pressure on the patient. The strongest, pointing out that there were still countless rows of monsters drinking blood, Yue once again tried to persuade the guy to surrender and give him the body, reinforcing this with the fact that he would erase every single one and no one would escape his punishment. And Shan caught the most important thing from all this. The other said that he would erase every single one, which confirmed the guy's fears that the force was destructive. Yue finally entered into a dialogue and told the strongest that they were completely different, asking again if he had forgotten what he had once said. The guy thought back to that day when the streets were illuminated due to loud and bright explosions. At a time when in one part of the city a fire was burning above the houses, garlands were hanging in a small courtyard, and people were dancing around the fire. The people were dressed in white robes with a black cross painted on them, and weapons hung behind their backs. This whole spectacle was observed by two boys who were still alive. The guys were sitting away from the dancing crowd, and were clearly not happy to be here, and Ah Chun looked carefully in the direction where one man was giving bread to another. A gray-haired man came up to give bread to the boys, and when Shan had already extended his hand, Chun stopped him and asked his grandfather what he would eat then. The old man patted the guys by the hair and told them not to worry about him, because he was already quite old to eat a lot, and the guys would be able to repay him as soon as they got back on their feet. Ah Chun thanked his grandfather, and Yue looked at his friend, not understanding what was happening. Not knowing much yet, Shan asked an older and smarter friend, maybe they should stay here, to which Chun replied, no way. Yue asked why they couldn't stay because it was so cozy here, and Chun asked his friend to listen better. Chun focused not on music or dancing, but on other sounds in the form of endless screams. No matter how nice these people may seem at first glance, they were cruel because they also had to survive. Not everyone was allowed inside, separating families as they pleased, mostly letting women and children through. Shan looked at the beautiful picture, which with every word from his friend in the background became more and more distorted, because Chun explained that this place and all these people are even worse than bandits, and if they stay here, they will become the same. Chun finished chewing his bread, telling his friend that he didn't want to grow up like them. Then Yue, turning to the people in white cloaks, said that this world is rotting because of the cruelty of the awakened ones. Chun diluted the seriousness of his friend by laughing and saying that, unfortunately, he himself was a kind of awakened one, and raised a piece of bread a couple of centimeters above his hand, to which Yue replied that Chun was completely different from those awakened ones. Chun looked up and asked Shan, what if there was a completely different world in which there was not a single awakened person, and then asked if his friend thought that in such a world there would be much fewer scoundrels, to which Shan replied that this was impossible. Chun also pointed out Yue's words about the impossibility of another world, about the bread that his friend was holding in his hand, that before everyone received their fair share, and now that everything belongs to the awakened ones, they eat their food as charity. And Chun took advantage of the fact that his friend was thoughtful, and saying that it was unlikely that the awakened ones thought that anyone would accept their charity. With such statements, he reached for a piece of Yue. Shan cried out that he wanted to save a piece of bread for later, but Chun, already stuffing food into his mouth, warned that there was no point in sitting with his mouth open. The guy sat and watched a more terrible picture than what was outside the gate, and so Chun said that it was time for them to return to their reality. Having finished with the memories, Yue noticed that in the area of his heart, the same sapphire glow appeared as his eyes, and he told the strongest that he would not receive this body. This was the guy's final decision, and it shattered the veil that the other had laid over his eyes and ears. Changes inside led to changes outside, and at that moment when everything inside Yue shattered, then outside it was as if something that had been holding him in chains for a long time came out of him, and Lu saw it. The guy stood up, glowing with sapphire light, and addressed the owner by name. Shan raised his head with a completely different look and eye color, and told Z that he could still fight. Lu was incredibly pleased that everything was finally becoming more interesting. And while the guys were warming up, the gates to the zone of jurisdiction rose to release the half-breeds from there. The very enemies that Shinho feared had already entered the exile zone, inhaling the dirty air and reporting that everything was like the good old days. 6 guys in suits confidently went to fulfill the mission that was intended for them. A truck was driving along a winding mountain road, and one of the drivers reported by phone that they had taken the bodies. The worker reported that the injuries of the 2 ghosts they were transporting indicate that everything was much worse than expected. In the cargo area, 2 wounded ghosts lay on couches, and the worker reported that they found almost no traces of the attacker, but made the assumption that the one they were looking for headed to the exile zone. A voice on the other side said that the one who was able to hide would not go far because hybrids had already been sent after him. Fog covered the walls connecting 2 different zones, but this was not an obstacle to opening the gate. 1 girl out of 6 hybrids began to be indignant that the gates were opening too slowly, and the guy standing next to her asked to keep quiet because she was disgracing them, and another young man whom the boy was holding on to was just talking to the chief that they would intercept those they needed. The workers accompanying the prisoners were wearing special glasses, and one of them thought that he did not remember that the jurisdiction had a separate area for containing black rings. The most impatient girl of all abruptly moved from her place towards the guards. At one point, a razor-sharp sword appeared at the man's throat, and the girl asked what the guard was staring at, and out of fear he began to stutter and ask for forgiveness. The cutie flashed her bright eyes looking straight at the guard's glasses. The equipment on the man's face began to go crazy and glow so brightly that the worker at some point lost his vigilance. And after the bright colors, the glasses exploded right on the guy's face, and he screamed in terrible pain. The girl stood and kicked the worker, asking if he had seen enough, and threateningly told him to look again. And while she was angry, another worker pointed a gun at her, but he could not shoot. The evil one turned to finish off the other worker, but she was stopped in time by one of the hybrids who ended the conversation with the chief. The guy told the girl named Thea to stop fooling around, because it was time for them to get to work because plans had changed, and they needed to split up so that 2 of their group would go to intercept the awakened special rank before he came to the exile zone. The one who looked the coolest and stood in front of everyone asked who these 2 would be. Thea responded, and turning around was already running to complete the task, and the friend who told her to keep quiet also volunteered, and another young lady who was older sighed nostalgically, noting the enthusiasm of the guys and remembering her youth. The guy and the girl separated from the main group and set off to meet the guests, while the rest went to those who were already in the zone. The city was noisy like a huge living colony, and in the midst of all this, someone who was accustomed to completely different sounds arrived. Moving softly and deftly like water, Zhou Shi appeared in the jurisdiction zone. Despite the stone-iron jungle, Shi moved around the city with ease. The guy was extremely focused on reaching his destination. In one of the buildings that she passed, workers in overalls were busy creating circuit boards. Joe stopped near this building because he felt threatened. The owner's sword was always ready to defend or attack. At the moment when she felt something suspicious, he was on the roof of the building. For now, only the train could distract attention, but the guy felt that somewhere nearby they were already waiting for him. It was not without reason that Joe felt that something was wrong, because on the roof of the house where he was inside, there was his enemy, who was muttering under his breath that he was not an idiot to fight openly because he had just gotten out of prison. So he will be here, and he just needs to detain Guy. The chalk drawing on the floor was almost ready, and it was a labyrinth with a little man drawn inside. The hybrid completed the finishing touches and, looking at his creation, realized that it was ready. All that remained was to revive the drawing, which is what this craftsman did, which is why the lines on the floor began to glow. And from the outside it manifested itself so that instead of the usual walls of the labyrinth, houses rose high up. It didn't matter whether the houses were low or high, because they all fulfilled the task that the guy came up with for himself. Since she did not yet understand what was going on, he only watched what was happening and felt movement under his feet. The factory workers stopped and began asking each other if they had all felt some movement under their feet. One of the workers shouted that this was not an earthquake because he saw the buildings moving, and everyone who could rushed to the exit. The buildings really grew like mushrooms after rain, obediently fulfilling the task of their master. Behind Chi, trains fell and more houses appeared, and he tried to see the direction in which he could go. And every time Joe looked in the direction where the house was not yet there and he could run, an obstacle would definitely appear there. Panic and lack of understanding of what to do were not about this trained and disciplined man, so he just waited. The last building reached its height and blocked the possibility of getting out. She found himself driven into a dead end, like the little man in the picture, looking up at a small piece of the sky towards which the birds flew up. The monk realized that they had decided to drive him into a trap, and activating his power, he said that he did not have time to play hide and seek. C climbed up with deft leaps to get out of the trap, and now the monk had the opportunity to escape from the trap, but another owner was watching him. The guy drew chalk along the floor, drawing another line, and thought to himself that Joe would not get out. She was just making a jump when another obstacle appeared in front of him in the form of a house. Joe was not one to give up and continued to climb to where there was still an opportunity to get out. As soon as the guy wanted to grab the wall of the house to jump higher, the building disappeared. The monk grabbed his head and began to go down and landed back where he started his attempts. Standing on that very roof, she realized that he had returned to his starting point and was again looking at a piece of the sky. It seemed as if there was even less space, and even if the walls simply stood still, they still looked oppressive. Another guest flew over the bridge and was supposed to intercept Thay. The robot had the ability to get anywhere in the world using jet propulsion, but the machine's processor displayed a warning about a malfunction of the energy core, and an emergency landing was recommended. The jet thrust began to weaken, and it was clear that this was Thea's doing. The robot froze in place and looked down carefully, trying to detect an obstacle. The mechanism found a very nice girl on the bridge who waved greetings to him. Thea smiled very friendly, but her image became worse and more distorted. And when the girl told the robot to go down, he, not expecting this, actually began to descend lower and lower towards the bridge. Chin had already called Xing Ho and warned him about the arrival of the guests, and the girl thanked him and told him to find somewhere to hide, warning that there was no point in returning and that she would be fine. The girl finished the conversation, and one of the sticks had already begun to slide down her hair, trying to fall into the hands of the mistress. Sinyo pulled out her assistant and said that she was so annoyed when people looked down on her. The owner turned to the containers and loudly declared to those who were on them that she was addressing them specifically. The remaining 4 hybrids carefully watched the equally strong rival. Sinyo smiled and kindly asked the guests who would like to die first. Since the hybrids had not yet taken any action, the girl again asked them if they really wanted to attack all at once, because it didn't make much difference to her. To which one of the uninvited guests said that the words were too loud. Sinno was not very happy that she had to stall for time until the guys finished their battle under the dome. The girl understood that even if Sean managed to awaken her power, it would most likely be telepathic abilities, which was the weakness of such awakened ones. Sinyo did not count on other descendants of the clan, so she concluded that when it was necessary to fight, she and Chuan would figure everything out. The coolest of the hybrids told the others that he had not been here for quite a long time, and the place looked even more terrible than last time. And the girl asked not to think of this hole as a place full of warm memories. While the four were chatting among themselves, Sinyo noted for herself the important point that all hybrids have black collars. The girl remembered everything her father told her and realized that he was right. Sinyo plunged her thoughts into childhood memories 14 years ago when she returned from training in the evening with a result of 98 wins and 2 losses. The girl was heading to her room but noticed that a light was burning under the doors that led to her father's office. The little girl knocked, telling her dad that it was her, and the father asked his daughter to come into the room. The father was sitting at the table with a bunch of papers. But despite being busy, he asked his daughter not to exhaust herself so much with training because the body was still growing and asked to find a balance, to which the young lady said that since she was so young, she would recover quickly. The girl made tea for Dad, saying that he shouldn't stay up late because he didn't want his father to die early, and Mr. Pei was amused by the fact that his daughter was sharp-tongued as always, and Xingho was worried that his father had not drunk tea while it was hot. Mr. Pei, like a mischievous child, reluctantly agreed to drink freshly brewed tea, but Xingho did not bring the mug into her hands because she saw important papers on her father's desk. In some table, the girl was attracted by the already familiar name of one of the great families, and it was Liu. The gentleman drank tea looking at his daughter while the little girl looked at the papers and quietly wondered where Mrs. Wu Yue was hidden, and she felt very sad that the search had taken so long. The father repeated his daughter's question, where the lady could really be, and expressed his great desire to find out about this too, since if he found her, Mr. Pei would be able to more often carefree communicate with his daughter and drink hot tea. Sighing heavily, the father replied that the price of such happiness as his and his daughter's time together is the freedom of Mrs. Wu Yue. Mr. Pei showed his daughter a frame from CCTV cameras, asking if she recognized the logo on the trucks, and Xingho, knowing quite a lot, immediately answered that these were special trucks from the heavenly city, but noted that the video was filmed in the exile zone. The father confirmed his daughter's words about the location of the trucks, and that the recording was indeed made in the exile zone. Mr. Pei bent over the papers, thinking out loud about the fact that recently 8 families have become more active and are constantly catching children with black rings. Looking at the reports and observations, the father told Xingho that in just 2 weeks, more than 1,000 awakened ones were captured. Sinyo was horrified by this figure and asked the most important thing from her father, what they were going to do with these children. The head of the Pei family answered his daughter that after analyzing many different options, they all led to only one conclusion. The captured children were raised in a special way in order to destroy potential enemies of the 8 families. The most pompous of the hybrids mockingly said that it was time for them to stop ignoring their enemy, thereby hinting that it was time to start fighting, to which another guy from their group, kicking the cool one, clarified that he wasn't the first to decide to evade the main topic. The serious guy with whom the chief kept in touch very gallantly appealed to the others to let him sort everything out. But the bright girl stopped the gentleman, explaining that if he did this, it would be like mutilating a painting, and added that she did not want the beautiful girl to die in such a vile way. Having gracefully said her speech, the girl also went downstairs near the containers. She went to meet Xingho, saying that you couldn't say that about her because she kills differently. And looking at Xingho Pei with her snake eyes, the hybrid said that she would give the owner a graceful death. Although Sinho was not a snake, her father was right about the sharpness of the tongue, and the girl threw it to the hybrid so that she could show what she could do. The 3 of the guys were left sitting on the containers, and the one who was smarter concluded that Liu and Shan most likely took refuge in that strange dome, to which the cool guy displeasedly called them cowards, and both thought about why don't they just get inside. The cool guy said that there was no need for such a rush, and it was better to wait until Xia Mei beat Xingho Pei half to death, which would cause the guys to get out of the dome to help their friend, and laughingly added that then they would divide the trophies and he would take Liu Chuan for himself. The cool guy suddenly began to think out loud which of them was stronger, those who were closest to the divine rank, or those who fed on the substance of the divine. The serious boy looked at his brother and only silently shared with him this question that tormented them all. Under the dome, both guys froze in anticipation because Shan was just now beginning to come to his senses. Yue was frightened by the danger of the situation, because for a moment it seemed to him that the person inside had finally taken control. But the guy realized that, on the contrary, thanks to the strongest, he now sees absolutely everything. Liu was already unbearable, and he turned to Shan, asking what kind of crooked face he had, and the guy, looking at the owner, thought about how he could name the strongest, and given the color of his eyes, wanted to give the name Chernish. But at the same moment, Liu watched as Yue gave himself a tasty slap in the face. And not lagging behind the first, the guy's own hand added another one to him on the other cheek. Z looked at the boy in complete confusion about what he was doing, and Shan, without answering, understood in his head that the name Chernish was not to the liking of the strongest. Yue shouted to Chuan not to hesitate, but to attack, saying that he could cope with any of his attacks. For the first time, Shan understood why last time he could not see Liu appearing near him so quickly, and all because he moved like a charge of energy. Yue dodged the sparkling charges and realized that before he would never have been able to dodge the owner's attacks. But now that the guy saw all the trajectories in advance, this radically changes the situation. Shan still turned to the strongest, named Chernish, and said that he was right, that he could not cope alone, and repelled the attack of Liu, which he had already seen. And the guy was thrown back with a powerful blow, and then he told Blackie not to forget that his existence exists only thanks to busting Shan's ass all these 18 years in an attempt to survive. Yue seemed to be having a conversation with a friend, and continued to explain that in matters of survival, Blackie is no better than him, and clearly indicated that the strongest should not dare appear out of nowhere and belittle his right to exist as the owner. The boy froze for a moment because for the first time in all 18 years of his life, he felt completely himself. The guy was forced to emerge from the sea of thoughts again by the sudden appearance of Liu next to him. But now, when Shan felt that for the first time someone else besides Ah-chun was on his side, he was not afraid of blows. Yue admitted the existence of the strongest and the fact that he is now not alone, but pointed out to Chernish that this merit belongs to Shan. The young man slowed down after the impact almost to the end of the canopy, lifting particles of the road into the air behind him. When Shan stopped and wiped his face and then looked carefully at Liu, he realized that no matter what he attacked, he would survive everything. Chuan finally drew attention to the boy's eyes, indicating that something was wrong with them. But Shan was already picking up speed in order to finally experience his new skills in full force. Yue ran so fast that his hair fluttered like in the wind, and he told Blackie to stand behind and just watch. Liu had already made a shield against Shang's attack, but the boy had a different idea. Just now the young man was in front of Chuan, and now, flying in the air, he was above him. Shan put his fist ready to strike Z and, like the wind, approached the owner. Although Yue had taken possession of the ability, Liu was also still training and developing his skill. Therefore, the owner intercepted the guy's hand even before he struck. While in flight, Chuan changed the trajectory of the boy's attack, thereby spinning him even more and taking control of the situation. A powerful explosion occurred, and for a moment neither Liu nor Shan were visible. Only lightning sparkled from everywhere. Having descended from somewhere under the dome, Chuan was already holding the divine child tied in chains with the help of his strength. For the first time, the owner looked at the guy like that and said that without a special ability, he would never have dodged that blow. Liu looked at the smiling boy who was lying face down on the floor and asked if he was now able to see the future. Having approached Pei Xinghuo at a sufficient distance so that she could hear, Xiamei asked the girl to answer one question that interested her very much. Xinho, with all possible disgust, showed her opponent that she refused to answer questions, but the underhanded snake Mei, smiling sweetly, asked to give her a chance and at least hear the question. Mei began to explain that their team was given two tasks, the first to catch Shan Yue, and the second to kill the one who was now standing in front of her, and after Mei's explanations, she became curious why the 8 great clans needed the death of a girl from a high rank. The bastard decided to press on Xinho's sore spot, so she emphasized that she was not distinguished by any special features and that she only wore a worthless silver collar around her neck. Mei wanted to get down to business, so she pointed her finger at Pei and asked if she and the clans were enemies, or if perhaps the secret lay in the fact that the girl was special for another reason. The word insignificant could barely be heard coming out of Xinho's mouth, and it was the last calm before the storm. Having turned into a fiend of hell, Pei questioningly repeated the snake's words about the insignificant silver collar, which only meant that the bomb was about to explode. Mei smiled and sarcastically asked Pei if she had said something wrong towards the one who wears a trinket around her neck that hides her true essence. Xinho took out all the dirt that was pouring out of the viper's mouth, so without thinking twice, she launched a stream of flame above herself, as if it had been spewed out by a dragon and not her wand. When the wave of fire left, Mei was very pleased with how the performance began and continued to look closely at her opponent. The snake poked Xinho's nose with hypocritical regret at the fact that she had ruined their sweet conversation, but Pei clarified that it was strange, since she had aimed right at the pretty head. Now, Mei realized that she could put the empty chatter to rest and also enter the battle, so she ran in the direction of her opponent. Shinho got to work and began to release tongues of flame at the snake, mentally wanting it to show everything it was capable of. Mei deftly dodged each fire shot, approaching her target and throwing caustic remarks at Shinho about how she should improve her aim. Pei silently responded to the enemy's words, but the rage that raged inside her did not diminish, but only grew in order to strike harder. The first clash between the opponents occurred when Mei was able to overcome all the fire attacks and get close enough to Shinho to strike. Xiaomei touched Shinho's hand in an attempt to use her power, but she didn't dare do it yet because she was curious how far their battle would go. So as soon as Mei had the opportunity to strike the enemy blow after blow, she used it to disorient them. Among the many blows and sudden movements, Shinho managed to grab the snake's hand and thus take control of the situation. Pei, holding her opponent tightly, made a sharp jerk with her hand to the side to knock her down, but it turned out to be difficult. Shinho continued her attempt to put the upstart on her shoulder blades by holding her by the arm and pushing her further to the ground, and in addition, hitting her on the leg. But at the last moment, Mei broke free from Shinho's hands and jumping above the ground, kicked her in the head, but she was able to put up a defense with her hand. Skillfully manipulating her body, Zia found herself in an upside-down position, thus taking advantage of the opportunity to touch Pei's body again. Shinho immediately used her ability but missed because Mei pushed off with her hand and did a somersault to the side of her opponent. But after one fiery shot, another one followed, to which Zia turned around to understand which way to dodge again. This time, Mei again managed to avoid the blazing attack and continue such an interesting fight with the silver one. Mei was able to touch the body once again, rushing past Shinho, further goading her that the poor thing clearly felt inferior, because in the eyes of the golden ones, everyone else was wretched, regardless of the color of the collar. Pei made a swing, shouting at the snake to shut up, but she dodged and ran away laughing as if it was a funny game, and she managed to touch the girl to the quick again. In the distance, the click of a pistol bolt was heard, which was prepared for one person who needed to be finished off given the given tasks. And Pei would not be herself if she did not hear sounds that an ordinary person would not be able to hear from such a long distance. The girl activated a fiery swirl above her head in order to impair visibility for those behind her. And after the rotation, Shinho even made pillars of fire shooting out from under the ground, indicating to the young lady that she can't stand rats that strike from behind, and she clarified that she was talking about the rest of the team. The guy stood on one of the containers and saw a wall of fire, which meant there was nowhere to aim and no one to aim at. So the handsome guy laughed at his friend for getting caught. Yao Guang looked closely at the flames and silently accepted the sharp jokes of his teammate, because he knew that killing was a matter of time. The guy lowered his hand which held the gun, realizing that the moment of death had simply been delayed, but not canceled. Meanwhile, Mei, overcoming each pillar of fire, again decided to get closer to her victim, so she quickly moved in its direction. There is one last step left to get closer to your enemy to fulfill the promise of a graceful and beautiful death. Mei found herself close to Shinho, almost touching her body and looking into her very soul, asking if the girl's scars really hid those memories that were dragging her to the bottom. Barely touching and looking into the eyes of her opponent, Zia asked her to share what was weighing on her inside and to tell her about what she could not let go of. But instead of a blow or a spit in the eyes, Mei saw in front of her in an instant a fiery whirlwind taller than her, behind which Shinho was not visible. Mei began to look around to see where Pei had gone and could not understand how this had happened because the fire had also disappeared, and now there was neither the mistress nor her ability. So that the snake would not worry for a long time about not being able to find its victim, it returned, only this time from behind for a better effect of surprise. When Mei turned to the one she had underestimated, she heard only one question about whether she had decided on her last wish. Pei held one of her sticks in both hands, preparing to deliver a blow that she had not used before, and mentally asked Shan for forgiveness for the fact that now she needed to definitely finish the fight and not just drag out time. Pei put into her fury the thought that she was already pretty tired of this snake, and thus created an explosive wave behind her. By making a downward gesture with her hand, Shinho seemed to command her power to attack her opponent, and it looked not just like fire, but like a huge number of the same sticks that she wielded, only red hot. For the first time in the entire fight, Mei looked at what was approaching her with true fear on her face, but she did not move from her place. The explosion that occurred upon impact with the target was the size of the dome that stood nearby, which indicated the impossibility of survival. It was necessary to wait until the smoke cleared, since the force of the impact was great and nothing could be seen behind such a wall. The weapon returned to the mistress as she came closer to look at the result of her actions and ask one question, just like her opponent did at the beginning. Shinho asked, looking at the injured and no longer so confident Mei, how it felt to lose to someone who wears an insignificant silver collar. Xia sat on the ground with burns and cuts, breathing heavily because her body was burning, but at the same time she looked at her enemy. And the next moment the girl suddenly smiled widely, pleased with how much fun she had had. Sitting in a circle of fiery pillars, Mei laughed heartily, admitting that the entertainment was a great success, and that she liked Pei Xingho even more now, because she had proven herself to be one of the best silver espers. Xingho didn't react to the girl's empty chatter, even in the form of deathbed praise, but her gaze was fixed on the victim with whom she was determined to finish off. The pillars of fire stood tightly, and it was impossible to escape from them, since Pei had strengthened their effect. But Xia Mei did not even try to escape and only continued to look at her opponent with a wide smile on her face while burning alive. The smell of burnt flesh and its hissing rose into the air, and all this time, the guys watched this terrible picture. Little Dudu watched his little sister burn alive, and the sight made him squeeze his older brother's hand even tighter. The guy noticed how worried Dudu was and ruffled his hair, and explained that there was nothing to worry about since this part of the performance was Xia Mei's favorite. The handsome man casually tossed the baby who he decided to worry about and continued to watch the fire burning below. Dudu didn't answer because tears welled up in his eyes, but the older brother decided not to stop and added that the one he was worried about was already a corpse. While the black collars were dealing with the silver one, an alarm went off in the room where the video surveillance was being conducted. The observer alerted the guards via radio that there had been a failure in the surveillance system in cell B313 of the Western Block. The observer gave the order for those who were currently free to go into the cell to see what happened. The last thing the worker said was a warning about the danger, and for the guards to be careful because the one they were heading to had gone through a transformation stage. The guards went down to the floor they needed, and among all the cameras, the one that had broken down was immediately noticeable because it was flashing red. Instead of doors, the cells had glass walls, which one of the workers knocked on, calling the boy an asshole and indicating that he had gotten out of bed. The guard who had prepared the weapon suggested that his partner come in, and he agreed, because there was no other choice since he needed to find out what was broken. The glass wall rose, and the workers entered the cell very slowly, heading towards the guy who was lying with his back to them in the bed. At first, the worker without a gun simply addressed the boy but did not touch him, and he did not react in any way. But the guy suddenly opened his eyes, only pretending to be asleep when he felt the touch of the worker, but he behaved very quietly. In order for the guy to succeed, he needed to suddenly attack the guard from a quiet and sleeping state, and when he did this, the second worker shouted to calm down or he would shoot. The boy did not stop at grabbing the worker and did not get off, and the next moment he bit him. The guy bit off and spat out the guard's ear, then looked at the one standing behind him, indicating to quickly give him a pass. The worker backed away under the pretext that he needed to go to the wall where the pass was sticking out, but this was only a distraction. The boy was shaking all over and remained in the arms of one of the workers, extending his hand to the leaving guard for a pass. But instead of a miss, 2 shots rang out and traces of blood appeared on the wall, indicating a direct hit to the head and a fatal outcome. Another worker was riding in the elevator, responsible for delivering the corpse of the failed experiment to the necessary place in this entire anthill. That's how the days of the people working here passed, when they crossed paths in the corridor, and if some carried corpses on couches, others dragged fugitives back to their cells. Some were not treated with ceremony and were dealt with immediately if the fugitives did not intend to calm down and tried to get out of this hell. And when some were doing their job of selecting those who resisted, those appeared who finished what had been started, packing the guys like meat in bags and taking them away, reporting everything above. And all these murders could have taken place while someone was taking one of the dead down for further inspection and destruction. The route was already boring and familiar, as were all the sounds happening around, from the elevator ringing about arrival to the shots and screams in the corridor. The way the workers moved with the couches looked like a death conveyor belt, because while some were leaving with empty seats, someone else was carrying another corpse. When examining the man who had literally just been killed, the man let out a sad and heavy sigh as he looked at the barcode on the corpse's neck. The guy asked the senior worker that this was the most successful example among all the others in recent times, to which the old man replied that the camera was indeed some kind of unlucky one and ordered that the body be burned as quickly as possible. The guy pressed the button, and a fire broke out in the chamber, where the body was already, and added his thoughts that this was all some kind of mistake, because for 100 dead black collars, one transformed one appeared, but they treated him indifferently. The old man sat on a chair, and his whole appearance indicated that the work he was doing was not hard because of physical labor. So he responded to the guy's thoughts with a counter-question whether he knew how long this crematorium had been operating. To complete the experience, the old man told the guy the whole horror of how the stoves here have been burning non-stop for 10 years since the building was built, and everyone who is here has long since gone crazy. Regarding the black collars, the grandfather replied that they were not guilty of anything, but were only pursuing the goal of becoming espers and changing their fate. And when these children receive their powers, they hope that they will be able to escape from here, saving not only themselves. And in the end, their freedom is limited either to their cell or to their last run down the corridor until a bullet flies into their forehead. The old man drooped to such an extent that he lowered his head and finally said that the black collars will forever bear this brand on themselves. In the chamber, the boy's body made its last sounds of crackling and hissing before turning to ash and disappearing forever. Pei moved closer to her opponent, whom she had trapped in a fiery prison, continuing to hold the pillars high. Shinho looked at Mei, asking her to directly use her abilities before destroying her to the ground. But after taking a closer look, the girl noticed old scars that were visible through her opponent's clothes. This only meant one thing, that Xia Mei was perhaps also special like Xingho, but no one knew about it because she hid it. Xia was still sitting in the circle of fire pillars and looking at Pei. Smiling slyly, she said that no one said that she had not yet used her power. Shinho now decided to be sarcastic too, saying that it was clear why the air smelled like shit, because it turned out to be the abilities of an elegant lady. The girl felt uneasy from what she felt in her body, while looking at how the enemy did nothing but continued to sit in place. An incomprehensible purple point appeared near Shinho's shoulder, which looked very much like a sting, and it touched her. The next moment, the girl felt sensations inside her body in different parts that reminded her of explosions. Pei's skin became covered in purple veins as the toxin spread, and she couldn't say a word but just stared ahead, gradually losing her strength. Unable to support her own weight due to her weak muscles, Shinho fell helplessly to the ground, unable to do anything. The girl's most important weapon also fell from her hands to the ground, loudly and ringing, first on one side, then on the other, until it calmed down. Now both girls were on their knees, but the fire that was holding back Mei had disappeared, indicating that Shinho's strength had left her. Mei, still unsteadily, rose to her feet and exhaled heavily, that she finally had something to breathe and that she would not burn alive. The poisonous one approached her opponent and kicked her weapon with her foot now, as if it were a regular stick, saying that kneeling for too long was tiring, so now it was Shinho's turn to do the same. Poor Pei, from the spasms and the toxin in her body, began to cough up blood, and her skin became more and more covered with veins that were already poisoned. Mei stood in front of her victim, watching as she was enveloped in poisonous flowers, the seeds of which she had deliberately left behind. Although Pei's body was paralyzed, her head was working perfectly, so she remembered absolutely every touch that the poisonous one made, but at that moment she did not attach any importance to it. Being on her knees and in such a shitty position, Shinho still smiled, asking Mei if paralyzing through touch was really her ability, to which she answered negatively. The snake sat down next to its victim, lightly stroking her shoulder and reminding her that if the ability consisted only of paralysis, then it would not encroach on her life. Mei's soft touches changed to a tight grip on her opponent's hand, with which she could now do whatever she wanted. The guy from the team who was watching what was happening from above all this time heard how his partner wanted to tell about her ability, and in his head he continued for the girl that this ability is unique and belongs only to her. Mei held Shinho so that she wouldn't fall and looked at her closely, and at the same time mortally, each time explaining that she had control over the aging process. Yao Guang watched as his sister in misfortune played with the victim and understood that the latter had no chance because Xia possessed a truly deadly ability. The boy was flooded with memories of the sound of the machine cutting their hair and how that day he looked at the girl in front of him whose beautiful long hair was cut off, and they were the only two of all the children who did not cry. The boys then met with glances that were already empty at that moment. So unlike other children, they did not cry, but simply sat accepting their fate. But in their souls, a fierce desire to take revenge on someone in the future was born. From that moment on, although Yao Guang and Mei did not show it, they understood that they would stick together in the future. Even when the children were doused with cold water like in prison before being sent to their cells, the kids felt uncomfortable, but they didn't scream. Yao Guang would not have paid attention to his half-sister if the worker pouring water on them had not asked what kind of nasty thing she had on her body and whether it was contagious. The guy looked at the girl covered in scars, who bent over even more not from the cold, but from the fact that the worker called her an abomination. May was shaking at that moment, both from the cold and the anger she felt towards everyone who hurt her, and it no longer mattered whether it was words or actions. The girl seemed to feel the gaze of her future partner and brother on her, and when they stopped pouring water on her, she turned around, opening her eyes that were burning with righteous anger. A huge number of children were seated in a spacious hall in front of a screen where they were congratulated on their selection to participate in a new program for rebirth, and where they were was called the place where the fate of black collars would change. A beautiful speech and a picture flowed from the screen about how the only way for children to get rid of their low rank would be through an experience of awakening abilities that would reveal their potential. The guards stood among the rows of children, monitoring the situation, and some stood with their heads down, tired from this hard work, and some glanced out of the corner of their eyes at the children who sincerely believed what was being broadcast to them from the big screen. A pleasant voice explained to the children that those who successfully transform with the best results will have the opportunity to enter the pantheon. Guan sat next to his friend, and instead of the screen, he looked around with displeasure, quietly asking his friend if they were really sure that they could brainwash them. But he did not respond, sitting rooted to the spot in his chair. On the screen, the Pantheon representative smiled and clapped for a boy holding a bouquet of flowers to celebrate his chance to enter the gates of heaven, which looked beautiful, but so delusional. Guan tried to call his friend Qianlong again, but he had already believed in a blind dream that would never come true, giving only false hope and a desire to undergo transformation. Since his friend didn't react, Yao looked further down the row where he noticed the same girl he saw when they were getting their hair cut. But when Mei looked at Guan, her gaze left much to be desired, and she was clearly unhappy with the fact that the guy was staring at her. But this spoke of their difference from the others. Guan looked at the girl trying to remember her name, and they were the only ones who sat like that and looked to the side and not at the screen, standing out from the crowd. After the performance, all the children were brought to the buffet so that they could have a proper snack before continuing their journey on this conveyor belt. Tian noticed that someone approached Guan faster and managed to turn around with something, although the hand was already on his shoulder. Mei was able to sharpen the wand enough to stab the boy, saying that if he looked at her again, he would lose his eyes. But the girl was unable to thrust the sharp object into the guy because Tian managed to stop her halfway by exposing his hand to the blow, which immediately bled out. A security guard approached the guys, holding a stun gun to Mei's neck while Guan asked his friend if his hand was okay, and he replied that it was fine, and also asked how he was. Before leaving, the worker warned the children that their experience would end in an hour, after which they would no longer be able to throw their strength around left and right, so now they should eat and not waste time on nonsense. The poor guys stood there staring at the scary guy, not understanding why they were now being accused of starting a showdown. After the guards left, Guan went down to Mei asking if she could get up and walk, but she didn't react in any way. The boy, not hearing or seeing anything in response, decided to carefully touch the girl to check if she was alive at all. And then Mei jumped up, knocking Guan's hand away from herself, screaming furiously for him not to touch her under any circumstances. Feeling humiliated once again and not used to someone helping and caring, the girl turned around and ran away without eating. Qian immediately concluded out loud that judging by Mei's reaction, she had been with the Silver Foxes before arriving in this place, and Guan agreed with this judgment. The children took turns injecting the necessary substance into their hands for transformation, of which there was enough for everyone in that place. Everyone was divided into rows and put in a queue where the test subjects one by one approached the guard for their dose of changes. After the substance was administered, the children were allowed into the room one by one, with clear instructions to go to the chamber that corresponded to their ordinal number. Guan, standing opposite Mei without turning around, explained to her that he was staring because she seemed to him to be quite strong, unlike the others. Before entering the cell, the boy turned around to ask for forgiveness for touching the girl without asking. Mei looked at the guy with eyes full of indifference and disappointment with this life, but at the same time she behaved calmly and remained silent. When the guys turned their backs to each other and went to their cells, May said one single word that said a lot. Namely, she asked the guy to survive. Guan agreed with what the girl said and expressed his hope that they would all be able to overcome the transformation. When the test subjects were released into the cells, the guards rose to their places, yawning because they were tired but would not be able to sleep after midnight, since the work was just beginning. There was still one worker at the observation console, sleeping while changes were being made to the children in the cells. At some point, heartbreaking screams and cries of those who were having a very hard time with the transformation began to be heard from the cameras. The children approached the glass, knocking on it with their hands, trying to get out, but it was resistant to their blows. Some had a high fever and heavy breathing that was rapidly leading to a dying state. May also got it like everyone else, and she curled up in a ball on the floor from unbearable pain that seemed like it would never go away. In another chamber, it was impossible to see anything at all because it was filled with some kind of incomprehensible thick smoke, reminiscent of blurred colors. In the other chambers, you could see children dying from activated abilities, exploding or growing additional limbs. One of the workers, sipping a drink, walked away from the control panel, indicating to another to turn down the volume because all this screaming was too much for his ears. The guard, on command, lowered the slider to the very bottom, to the 0 mark, and the problem disappeared. And the fact that the picture remained did not bother anyone. Tien stood at the glass wall of one of the cells and quietly called his friend, believing that he had managed to survive and would now also come to the wall. Tien, without losing hope, looked towards his friend's camera and continued to call him, expecting to see him. Yao lay on his bed, sweating and closing his eyes from the bright light, but he could already distantly hear his friend's voice. Tien's call helped Guan understand that he was still alive and that what he heard was the real voice of his friend. So the guy opened his eyes, which were filled with the energy that personified his ability. But the body was still too weak for such changes, and the bright, unnatural color of the eyes disappeared after a moment. Yao stood up, swaying and shaking violently, and quietly answered his friend that he was here, and that a true friend would not be a friend if he did not say that if he died, he would despise him. Chen called his friend again to make sure that he was okay, and Guan, even with some irritation, replied that he was alive. Gradually getting off the bed and putting his feet on the floor, Yao pointed out to Tien that if there were still those who had not died, then his grumbling would definitely finish them off. Slowly, Guan, already moving more confidently, walked across the room in the direction of the glass wall to also see his friend and Mei. Tien liked Yao's joke about his grumbling, and he laughed at it when he saw Guan at the wall, happy about his brother's appearance. Guan first of all approached the wall, knocked on it, calling Mei and asking if she was there and if she was okay, then let her give some kind of sign. Poor Mei was still lying on the floor, curled up, and compared to the guy's rooms, hers was a complete nightmare, as if a hurricane was raging there and everything was upside down. The girl's fingertips were covered in blood, but when she heard the voice of the one she asked to survive, she made an effort and raised her thumb up just a little. Guana was quite satisfied with this gesture from his girlfriend, and he was already standing by the wall with a smile, holding on to it with one hand, imagining how much fun they would have together in the future. And then the guy heard signals. Yao turned around to where the signals came from and saw that the doors to their floor had opened, which meant that someone was coming towards them. Workers actually approached the cameras, discussing that this block had a good result and that there were 3 survivors numbered 310, 312, and 313, unlike the neighboring blocks where no one survived. The guards walked past the boys reading their names and stopped at the cell of the girl who managed to survive, which was even more rare. Lifting the glass wall, one of the workers leaned over to Mei to examine her, while his partner stood with a tablet in his hands, watching. The guard turned Xia onto her back, asking that she was the only survivor of all the girls in this group, and her partner checked the information and replied that this was true. The worker looked closely at the girl, but did not find any signs of changes, which alerted him. The guard asked his partner to wait outside the doors to check what Mei was now capable of, but he advised against taking such a risk since they were all just after the transformation and it could be mortally dangerous. But the worker asked his colleague not to be a bore and to do as he was asked, because he himself was wasting time and the test subject could get up and run away at any moment. Tien sat with his back to the wall studying his new abilities, while the guard's partner stood with a tablet in his hands waiting for him, and Guan carefully watched what was happening in Mei's cell. Tien was already quite good at controlling his power, and he watched his ability with fascination, like a cat watching a toy. In other chambers, there was deathly silence and dead bodies, and on the glass walls there were traces of their lethal transformation. Guan froze in anticipation of what Mei would do and hoped that she would not kill the guard so that nothing would happen to her for it later. Yao realized that even though they had survived and gone through the transformation, no one had led them to the gates of the Pantheon and handed them a bouquet of flowers. And their fate would not change because everything that was initially poured into their ears was complete nonsense. When the guard left Mei's cell, his partner ran up to him, screaming what had happened to his neck and face, but he didn't understand anything. Having noticed his hands, the worker was taken aback that not only were they in a shitty state, but he also felt the same way. Having unbuttoned his jacket, the guy was in even greater shock because his body was not only covered in some purple stripes, but also turned black as if it was burning alive. The guy's scream was the last one, after which he was paralyzed and turned into a silent, lifeless statue, while his partner called for help on the radio in the Western Block B313. The result of Mei's work fell to the floor, dying in terrible agony, and she watched it carefully, but calling for reinforcements would not have changed anything. The little girl stood in her cell, not taking her eyes wide off the stupid victim who decided that if she worked here, she was allowed to do anything, including humiliating the test subjects. And now Mei, looking closely at her victim again, explained to Pei that as soon as she touched her solar plexus, her heart would stop forever. Mei looked into Shinho's eyes for the last time, saying goodbye to her, even with a hint of pity that she would no longer have the opportunity to have fun with such a rival. Pei couldn't do anything, or even say anything, so Jia could only press her hand against her opponent's solar plexus. While the other heroes were quite close to Shan Yu, little Li was just preparing to run away from home to fulfill her brother's will, and at the moment, she had the task of removing the surveillance cameras from her path. The girl aimed the stone at the video surveillance device, telling herself that the blow had to be done very lightly and carefully. But unfortunately, the little girl didn't succeed because her gift made itself known, and instead of the camera, she knocked down a column of the house. Li ran to the knockdown column where the camera was attached to hold it down and not cause more problems. But if Li managed to knock down the column perfectly, then the camera fell unharmed right in front of her nose onto her hands while she was holding the stone block. Behind the gates of the garage where the family's cars were located, the beeping of the system could be heard, through which Li tried to enter the password for the entrance, but she did not succeed. And after another unsuccessful attempt, the system announced that the next attempt was in 10 minutes. 10 minutes was too much of a grueling wait for the young lady, so she once again took the path of least resistance and simply began to break down the armored garage doors with her fists. Li lifted the heavy gate with ease as it crumpled into a convenient accordion and pulled out the wire to immediately ease her fate with the alarm. Although the girl had a gift, it was still inside her body, which was still wounded after that skirmish with the demon, and the wound had not yet completely healed. Throwing aside thoughts of pain, the little girl entered the garage where she turned on all the lights to assess what kind of car she should take to get to the lands of the exiled. While the girl was looking at the cars, on one of them stood an unremarkable figurine of a monkey in glasses, not arousing any suspicion. But as soon as this figure noticed movement in the garage, one of its eyes immediately worked and blinked a red light, conducting video surveillance. It turned out that Miss Han had been watching her daughter from her office the entire time, while her assistant clutched her head and ran back and forth at the table, lamenting that Miss Li had stolen the phone and now also the car, which spoke of her serious intentions. The assistant could not stand it any longer and rushed to the lady in the garage to stop her from such a stupid act of going to the lands of the exiled herself. Miss Han herself remained calm the entire time and advised her assistant to do the same, since her daughter did not have access to cars. The servant breathed a sigh of relief, remembering that the cars were assembled by Mr. Su, who made sure that there was a recognition system, thanks to which only Mrs. Han and young Mr. Shu could drive the car, but the miss was already typing something on the keyboard. The assistant turned to Mrs. Han in horror, worried that her suspicions about the lady's actions had been confirmed. The servant's guess was correct because Lady Han reprogrammed the system so that the machine could be used, and all Li had to do was press the enter button. The little girl was sitting in one of the cars, holding two wires in her hands and remembering that she needed to connect them like they did in the movies. But Li didn't have to suffer for long because the doors of another car opened next to the car she was sitting in. Li was very surprised that her brother's car not only opened, but also the system started up and said that it was activated, and the user was changed from Han Shu to Han Li. The girl immediately climbed into the car into the passenger seat, happy that the situation was being simplified, and the system immediately recognized that the user was not yet 18 years old. Since the passenger was a minor, Yuenye's system activated the autopilot and slammed the door on Li's side, thereby frightening her, and then notified her that the navigator's seat had been successfully determined and now she needed to fasten her seatbelt. Li did everything as the system ordered and opened her phone and began to look at what location was sent to her brother in the group chat, to which the system again responded with lightning speed, asking whether the lady confirmed the destination or not. The car screen lit up with exactly the same destination point as on the phone, which once again made the situation easier. Li looked at the screen, realizing that she had done nothing to mark the location, and the only one who could was her mother. The system asked the young lady if it was necessary to change the destination to another one, but the girl replied that the location was correct and that it was possible to leave, which the system accepted as a command. The car, like a madman, pressed the gas pedal to the floor and spun the steering wheel, saying that it was happy to serve its mistress, while Li was thrown from side to side in the passenger seat, and she shouted at the system to slow down. Like a rocket, the car flew out of Han's domain, leaving behind dust balls, and in the distance, Li's cry could be heard. "Does the system even know how to drive?" To which she reported on her rich knowledge and study of the Introduction to Driving 1.0. Mrs. Han looked out the window as her daughter drove away in the car, and the assistant asked if she was not worried at all, since the young lady had never left her home and her family before. Instead of answering, Mrs. Han silently watched her daughter go, and at the same time she was immersed in memories, with which she could now describe why she was no longer worried. The words of the song began to play in Han's head, not in her voice but in the voice of Mrs. Wu Yue, who was singing it to her then unborn godson, and the women were chatting and laughing sweetly in the fresh air. Mrs. Yue communicated with the baby through her good friend's belly, telling her godson to come into this world safely. Han looked at this sweet sight and the love that was already enveloping her baby, and was also very much looking forward to meeting him. No one knew that something would happen that you wouldn't wish on your enemy, and the first person Han turned to was Yue, and her friend begged for help from the one who possessed immortality to save the newborn baby. Han did not understand how the one who loved and waited for this child so much was now inactive and did not provide any help at all. But Yue explained that with all her strength, she would not want to interfere with the fate that this little man had chosen, because she was not God to decide someone's life issue. Han's heart, which was already bleeding from fear of losing the baby, was now filled with anger from hopelessness. Han couldn't bear the pain that had consumed her, and threw it out by hitting the person closest to her in the face, but Yue took the blow without resisting. The poor girl was crying in front of her faithful friend, and the scream was tearing her apart from the inside into many pieces because, despite having the opportunity to help, she refused. Han then, without looking up at Yue, shouted that from now on she would hate her forever for how much pain she had caused her. The assistant, noticing that the lady had been standing silently for quite a long time and staring at one point, asked if everything was okay with her, to which she replied that everything was normal and she was simply remembering the old days. Mrs. Han looked out the window again and, although ambiguously, gave her assistant an answer, saying that the future could still be changed. At the moment when the mother said that she trusted her daughter, her hands trembled from the fact that they squeezed each other very tightly, because once Han also trusted but got burned by it. The car had already left the Pantheon and was driving onto the bridge that brought Li closer to the prefecture, while the oasis remained behind. The fresh air, the singing of birds and the plants were replaced by smog, grayness, and a bunch of cars, although the girl had not yet even entered the lands of the prefecture. There was a dirty, thick fog in the city, which made the advertising banners barely visible, and the noise and hum was so loud that your head would start to split over time. But for Li, this dirty and gray place was new, so she was amazed at how interesting and differently everything was arranged here. The girl sat herself down in the chair, shouting that she had no time to be distracted because the trip was important and serious and not for entertainment. Li understood that everything she saw was no longer what it was before, and now the prefecture belonged to bad people. The little girl picked up her brother's phone and, opening the chat where the location was sent, pressed the button to record a voice message. Li dictated a message to the boys that she was Han Li, that she was 14 years old, that she was Han Shu's younger sister, and since her brother was unable to join them, she had come to help in his place. A little worried, the girl sent her voice message, not knowing what to expect from guys much older than her. When Lee saw that the message status lit up as sent, she continued to look excitedly out the window, and her thoughts were only about the response from the other guys. The little girl was driving along the roads of the prefecture, looking out the window, thinking about whether her mother would forgive her for leaving so abruptly and, moreover, without saying goodbye. One huge high-rise building was replaced by another, and the bridges seemed to have no end, twisting between the roofs of houses. Lee was no longer staring out the window as she had been at the beginning, because her focus was on the phone and waiting for a response from the team. Perhaps not so much time has passed since the little girl once again looked at her phone in the hope of seeing the cherished answers there. But the same status was flashing on the screen, saying that no new messages had been received, and this was making the girl nervous, because a bunch of caustic thoughts immediately crept into her head. The system suddenly notified the lady that chat users can track location by default, so it advised the girl to check the locations of others, and Lee, burning with shame, asked her to do so. Yuan Ye reported that according to the coordinates, there were 2 people near the lady. But then the system's voice began to jam and change while she was saying that one of the people seemed familiar to her. Lee turned to the system, but it did not respond, and some kind of bug began to occur with the screen, since the hologram began to delaminate into pieces. Yuan Ye's system suddenly accelerated sharply, maneuvering along the road lanes between cars, driving into the oncoming lane, but did not respond to the girl's comments and questions about where she was taking her. One thing was clear. The car was heading strictly along the course to the beacon from which the failure occurred, and it was emitting an approaching signal and was driving at a crazy speed. However, certain birds were able to fly into the prefecture to help their owner find what he needed from their height. Cheese, as it turned out, was also sitting in the chat waiting for his partners to respond, but no one wrote, which made the guy bored. The young man raised his head and looked up from his phone, feeling a chill run down his spine, although there was no reason for it. Having carefully checked her drawing, Cheese saw that the little man was in place in the very heart of the labyrinth, which meant there was no reason to worry. But at the moment when the guy realized that the little man in the picture had not moved for a long time, birds began knocking on the window, chirping loudly. Cheese realized that he was in bad shape, but he couldn't move from his spot, continuing to look at the birds, which were only becoming more numerous. The guy saw the silhouette of the one called the birds and couldn't believe that he managed to trick the kid as cleverly as he did with him. Breaking the window glass, Zhou Shi and his loyal assistants burst into the room, holding his hand on his sword. Zhou confidently walked across the floor in the direction of his enemy, and the glass crunched loudly under his shoes, but the guy was not distracted by this. The little man drawn by Cheese was still in the drawing in the center of the maze, although he was now right in front of him. The guy stepped back, taken aback, asking Si how he was able to get out without it going unnoticed. Sai explained to the enemy that he had managed to carry out some kind of experiment after realizing that the young man's ability was to sense and direct the flow of power. Realizing how to deceive the deceiver, Joe pressed the blade of his sword to Chiz's neck, indicating that as he could see, the experiment had been successful. Cheese looked at his enemy indifferently, continuing to ask about what was in the middle of the labyrinth instead of Si himself. The owner again explained that he was able to concentrate his energy there, thereby creating a similar one to himself to distract attention. Getting further to find Chiz was not an easy task, so in some houses there were gaping holes from which the remains of concrete slabs were still falling. Factory workers were the first to witness something or someone passing through a wall, which was not the most pleasant experience for ordinary people. Joe, without removing the sword from the scoundrel's neck, indicated to him that now it was his turn to ask questions about how many of them were here in total and why he was the only one here and the others were not visible. But the most important thing that interested Shi was the question of how the black collars could use power. Cheese thought in his head that he was not going to answer this idiot, even though he understood that his head could fly off his shoulders. But instead he tried to soften Joe's anger by asking about the fact that monks don't kill. Bringing the blade close enough to his neck to injure him, Shi ordered the guy to answer questions and not to talk trash. Cheese replied that it was clear to him what was said, because only a complete idiot would not answer when the sword was at his throat, and after a moment he pretended to choose which question to start with, while his hand reached for the drawing. Putting his hand on the drawing, Cheese delayed a little more, saying that he would be happy to answer all questions, but there was one thing. And when the guy felt that he could again control what he had drawn, he looked at his opponent, wondering what the very thing was. Was there time to listen to the answers? At that moment, the young man ran his hand through the labyrinth, and a loud sound of a falling building burst through the window along with a wave of dust. Joe saw out of the corner of his eye that the houses that were used to act as walls for the labyrinth were now collapsing like cards. Cheese took advantage of the moment while the enemy was distracted and putting his hand to the floor beneath him, made a slab out of it that separated and began to descend downwards like a hovering platform. The young man was pleased with himself and, already going down to the floor below, he pointed out to the monk that he had a choice to pursue him in order to get answers or to save people, because time was passing and they were under the rubble. The guy certainly had no time to despair, and he chose to save many lives instead of chasing someone who could lay waste to an entire city while running. Joe jumped onto the window frame and commanded the birds that it was time for them to go, because he felt that the house he was in would collapse as soon as the enemy came out of it, and this could happen at any moment. Cheese finally managed to get through to Thea, and she asked him discontentedly what he needed, because she was busy, to which the young man happily said that his plans had changed and he was heading towards her, and at that moment a building creaked and fell behind him. At that moment, Thea was fighting with a robot that also arrived to help Sean, but the girl intercepted it with the help of her ability to control electronics. The girl was not against her partner joining her, but asked not to disturb her upon arrival, as she was having fun with the guest. After hanging up, Thea looked at the robot, smiling widely from the fact that she had returned to a more interesting conversation. The girl mocked the robot, asking if he was still holding on, and each time she hit him harder with her sword, not sparing her opponent for a moment. At that moment, the robot had two errors displayed on its panel: the inability to launch the upper limb repulsors and an unstable signal. Joe, meanwhile, was rushing at full speed with his feathered warriors to help the people who were trapped under the rubble. The guy knew that the birds were more agile and sensitive than him, so he asked to help show him the way to the black collars. The birds immediately rushed to where there was the largest concentration of people who had piled up or were already running out of oxygen. The buildings fell one after another, in addition to those that Chiz started with, which complicated the task many times over, but the monk's assistants, like himself, were not going to give up. The corridor of one of the factories was creaking from its own weight and crunching with sparks coming from torn wires. And in an instant, a green whirlwind rushed through this corridor at supersonic speed, overcoming walls and doors. Joe headed where his assistants pointed him, and finally the first person was visible, who was piled up in a column. The monk lifted the column and freed the man, taking the poor fellow on his shoulders to take him out of here and hand him over to those who would be conscious to provide assistance. Like the wind, the guy moved from person to person, picking them up and carrying them out of the building, which was collapsing with every second. Joe rose higher to those who needed help, clearly following the path that the bird showed him. Thanks to his transformation into a light element that could appear anywhere, she combed through all possible corners incredibly quickly. Those who survived found themselves trapped and tried to open the doors to get out by leaning on it. But it was all in vain since a blockage had already formed behind the door. People felt even worse after the last hope of getting out disappeared, because those who pushed the doors said that there was debris behind them blocking the exit. The workers clutched their heads in panic because although they were alive, it wouldn't be for long, because they wouldn't have enough oxygen until the rescuers arrived and they would die of suffocation. Some of the workers fell to the floor, experiencing wild horror that they would die here alive among the others, like in a huge grave. Some employees still tried to check the windows and doors again, but this did not lead to anything and only escalated the situation even more. One of the workers put his ear to the door which they tried to open, but nothing worked, and now he heard some sounds behind it. The guy turned to everyone, thinking that he had already gone crazy from lack of oxygen, and reported that he heard birds chirping outside the door. The doors that had resisted several people swung open wide and birds flew in, and people stared at them as if they were gods who had come to save them. And the birds really did start grabbing people by their hoods and clothes and pulling them out from under the rubble, although not everyone wanted this and ran away screaming from the birds, thinking that they had definitely gone crazy from nerves. The birds pulled workers out from under the rubble, sometimes at a very great height, thereby forcing the already frightened guys to scream because they were about to fall and would definitely crash to their deaths. But none of the rescued people crashed, but on the contrary, successfully landed on the surviving platform, where they would at least be safe now. Many people were already sitting down, having come to their senses, and some were coughing and trying to breathe in some fresh air. Some needed help, but Joe did not stop and continued to save them, flying like the wind from place to place. When everyone the monk was able to save was outside the house, he finally collapsed, roaring like a wounded animal. Joe went down to one of the guys who was safe and sound, asking him to take care of the man he was holding in his arms. The woman lay half dead on the concrete floor, crying and calling for someone named Xiao Chu, unable to even get up. Overcoming her pain, the girl jumped up, frantically shouting that she needed to find Xiao because he was still inside the building, and one of the workers pricked her with the remark that she had been told not to bring a child to the factory. The girl, sobbing and already regretting what she had done, shouted that she had no choice, because otherwise the baby would have remained in the land of the exiled and would have died too. The building was crumbling before our eyes as if it were made of matches, raising dust and other debris in streams of air so that we had to cover our faces with our hands. The girl closed her mouth saying the name of her baby and sobbing because he might already be buried alive. But she heard someone ask the only question, where? Joe asked again where exactly the girl's son was, and the poor fellow, stuttering with fear, answered that he was in the lower-tier warehouse. The monk immediately went to the building, and the girl did not even have time to say anything to him, but only watched with tears in her eyes as he went to certain death. The feathered assistants stopped their master in every possible way, but he went on without being distracted by them. When one of the birds landed on its owner's hand, he stroked the little one and assured her that everything would be fine with him, just as it had been before. Joe rushed to the building before it was too late, and his assistants remained in place, watching their hero. It was at that moment that she found himself somewhere among the rubble of the building that it completely collapsed, causing the frightened birds to fly up into the air.